After my wife Evelyn passed away, I found a rusted iron key and a strange transfer deed hidden beneath her daily pillbox. It was for a place called Cottage 42. I kept it a secret from my son, knowing the truth would completely destroy him. 1 week later, he and his wife walked through my front door and handed me an eviction notice. They told me they were selling my house and shipping me off to a nursing home. I did not yell, I did not cry, I just smiled, because what they did not know was that the secret cottage was not what they thought it was, and neither was I. My name is Vincent. I am 69 years old, and my story will show you exactly what happens when greedy children severely underestimate a quiet old man. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach someone a brutal lesson about respect. The silence in my house was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It had been exactly 7 days since I buried my beautiful Evelyn. 40 years we had been together. 40 years of sharing morning coffee, of her smoothing the collar of my work shirts before I went down to the printing press, of building a life from nothing but love, sweat, and elbow grease. Evelyn had died after a brutal battle with illness, leaving a hole in my chest so vast I thought the winter wind might blow right through it. I was standing in front of her memorial on the mantel, staring at her smiling photograph, when I held up the items I had found earlier that morning: a heavy rusted iron key and a folded piece of thick parchment paper. I had discovered them taped to the very bottom of her wooden pillbox, a place she knew I would look once she was gone. The document was a transfer deed dated years ago, legally conveying a property simply named Cottage 42. My rough hands trembled as I read the coordinates printed on the paper. Evelyn had kept this from me, or rather she had saved it for me, waiting for the right moment. I was a retired mechanic to the outside world, a man who kept his head down and his mouth shut. But Evelyn knew the real me. She knew the mind I kept hidden behind my grease-stained hands. I was just beginning to process the magnitude of this secret when the harsh sound of the front door swinging open shattered the sacred quiet of my morning. They did not knock. The heavy oak door slammed against the wall, and in walked my son Tyson, followed closely by his wife Madison. Tyson, my own flesh and blood. A boy I had worked double shifts to put through college, marched into my living room wearing a tailored suit that cost more than my first car. He looked anywhere but at my face. Behind him, Madison clicked her expensive designer heels across my hardwood floors. She pulled off her oversized sunglasses, her pale eyes scanning my humble living room with unfiltered disgust. She came from a wealthy white family that had always looked down their noses at us, and she carried that quiet, insidious sense of superiority in every single step she took. She did not offer condolences. She did not ask how I was holding up on the 1-week anniversary of losing the love of my life. Instead, she reached into her expensive leather tote bag, pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers, and tossed them onto the coffee table right next to Evelyn's memorial. The thud echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Vincent, Madison said, her voice dripping with that specific kind of polite venom she reserved only for me. We need to handle the practical matters. Tyson and I have already signed a contract with a cash buyer for this house. You have exactly 7 days to pack your things. We have selected a very suitable nursing home for you across town. It is practically a resort for seniors, so there is no need to be dramatic about it. I stared at her, the rusted key burning a hole in my pocket. 7 days. My wife was barely cold in the ground, and my privileged daughter-in-law was kicking me out of the home I had paid off decades ago with my own sweat and blood. I looked down at the papers. It was a fast cash sale agreement drawn up and signed without a single word to me. She stood there crossing her arms, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to beg. She thrived on the power dynamic, fully expecting the tired old black man to submit to her authority. I slowly turned my gaze to Tyson. The boy who used to sit on my shoulders and pretend to touch the stars was now a 38-year-old man hiding behind his wife. Tyson had always been ashamed of his roots, always chasing the approval of Madison's wealthy family, desperate to erase the fact that he came from a working-class background. Tyson, I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. Are you going to stand there and let her speak to me this way in my own house? Tyson shifted his weight, loosening his expensive silk tie. He finally met my eyes, and the sheer arrogance and cowardice I saw there broke whatever remained of my paternal heart. Dad, let us be realistic, Tyson muttered, taking a step back as if my grief might infect him. This house has always been legally in Mom's name. You put it in her name years ago for tax reasons. Well, Mom is gone. As her only child, I am the legal heir. Madison and I have ambitious plans. We need the capital for our new investment firm, and we cannot afford to wait. Living here alone is not safe for you anyway. You are getting old, you are forgetting things, and the nursing home is the best option for everyone involved. My own son. He was using the legal technicality I had set up to protect his mother as a weapon to strip me of my dignity. He stood there letting his calculating wife dictate the end of my life, treating me like obsolete machinery ready for the scrapyard. He was willing to throw me away just to fund his desperate attempts to impress his father-in-law and fit into a world that would never truly accept him. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. They looked at me and saw an old, grieving, tired man. They saw a retired blue-collar worker who drank cheap coffee and lived a very simple life. They thought I was defenseless, uneducated, and easily discarded. They thought this modest house was my entire world, the absolute only asset of value I possessed in this life. They genuinely believed that by taking the roof over my head, they were taking my power. I looked at the fraudulent eviction notice, then at Madison's smug, entitled smirk, and finally at my son's cowardly posture. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me, chilling my veins. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not beg them to respect the man who had given them everything. Instead, I slowly reached into my pocket, my calloused fingers wrapping tightly around the rusted iron key Evelyn had left me. I felt the heavy metal press against my palm, a silent promise of the storm that was about to come. I looked right at them and smiled. A slow, terrifyingly calm smile that made Tyson shift uncomfortably. 7 days, I replied quietly. Understood. They turned and walked out, victorious and arrogant, believing they had just conquered a weak old man. But as the door clicked shut, my smile widened. They had absolutely no idea that this house was nothing compared to Cottage 42, and they were about to learn that they had severely underestimated the wrong man. I waited until the sound of Tyson's luxury sedan faded completely down the street before I finally moved. I did not waste time dwelling on their blatant disrespect. I had a destination, and I needed answers. I walked out to the driveway and climbed into my rusted 1998 Ford F-15. Oh, a battered truck Tyson had begged me to scrap a dozen times because it embarrassed him. The engine sputtered in protest, then roared to life with a familiar, comforting rumble. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and carefully typed in the exact longitude and latitude coordinates printed on Evelyn's hidden deed. I fully expected the navigation to point me toward the rural outskirts of the county, perhaps to an abandoned patch of woods or a dilapidated fishing shack near the river. Evelyn called the property Cottage 42 after all. But as the digital map plotted the route, my brow furrowed in deep confusion. The blue line did not lead toward the countryside. It directed me straight into the beating heart of the valley's newly developed high-tech corridor. I drove for 40 minutes, watching the landscape drastically shift from modest residential neighborhoods to towering structures of gleaming glass and polished steel. This was the most expensive zip code in the entire state, home to billionaire tech executives and sprawling corporate campuses. The GPS instructed me to turn onto a private, immaculately paved access road. I slowed the truck to a crawl, absolutely convinced the machine had made an error. The automated voice announced I had reached my destination. I shifted the truck into park and stared through my dusty windshield, utterly paralyzed by what stood before me. There was no cottage. There was no humble wooden shack, no overgrown garden, no quaint retirement retreat. Instead, I found myself parked in front of a massive, imposing wrought iron gate flanked by 2 towering stone pillars that screamed of exclusivity. Beyond the heavy metal bars stretched an expansive, breathtakingly pristine plot of undeveloped land. I stepped out of the truck, the cool afternoon breeze hitting my face as I walked cautiously up to the gate. The rusted iron key sitting in my pocket suddenly felt as heavy as a solid gold brick. Next to the main vehicle entrance was a smaller pedestrian gate secured by a heavy, old-fashioned padlock that had been cleverly integrated into a modern electronic security panel. With a shaking hand, I slid Evelyn's key into the keyhole. It fit perfectly. I turned it, and the heavy lock released with a loud, echoing click. I pushed the gate open and stepped onto the property. The sheer scale of it was staggering. It was easily 50 acres of prime, untouched real estate. To my left, just beyond a line of ancient oak trees, the headquarters of a global software conglomerate buzzed with activity. To my right, a massive new commercial plaza was actively under construction, and sitting squarely in the middle of it all, an absolute gold mine of undeveloped potential, was Cottage 42. I walked the perimeter, my boots crunching against the dry earth, my mind struggling to grasp the astronomical reality of my situation. This was the last, large, unbroken tract of land in the entire Tech Valley. Developers would kill for this zoning. Corporate titans would wage war to acquire this much continuous acreage. I fell to my knees and scooped up a handful of the soil, letting it run through my calloused fingers. Evelyn had not just left me a secret retreat. She had left me an empire. She had hidden a fortune of unimaginable proportions right under everyone's noses, slapping a mundane title on the deed to throw off any suspicion. In the current market, this single parcel of land was easily worth tens of millions of dollars. Tyson and Madison thought they were incredibly clever, plotting to steal a modest 3-bedroom house to fund their fake lifestyle, entirely oblivious to the fact that I now held the keys to absolute generational wealth. As I stood back up, the sheer brilliance of my late wife brought hot tears to my eyes. Back in the 1980s, the real estate market was a heavily rigged game against people who looked like us. A black mechanic and a black schoolteacher trying to buy commercial acreage in a rapidly developing county would have been laughed right out of the bank or denied through quiet systemic redlining. But Evelyn had an exceptionally sharp mind for numbers and an unmatched understanding of corporate law. She created a complex labyrinth of blind trusts and proxy shell companies to purchase this land piece by piece, acre by acre, completely masking her true identity from the sellers and the banks. She navigated the legal loopholes with absolute precision, securing this kingdom for us and protecting it from a world that was systematically designed to keep us at the absolute bottom of the ladder. The shock of the discovery was still coursing through my veins, making my hands shake as I drove the truck back toward my side of town. My gas gauge dipped toward empty, bringing me back to the immediate practical reality of the day. I pulled into a brightly lit service station just outside the tech park to fill up the tank. I walked inside to pay for the gas and grabbed a bottle of cold water to calm my racing heart. I handed my debit card to the young cashier. It was the only card I carried tied to the primary checking account that held my pension, my Social Security benefits, and over $40,000 in hard-earned life savings. I swiped the card. The terminal beeped with a harsh, rejecting tone. Declined. I frowned, assuming the old magnetic strip was acting up again. I politely asked the young man to run it one more time. He wiped the card on his shirt and inserted the chip. The machine beeped again. Declined. The cashier gave me an uncomfortable, pitying look that made my jaw tighten. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a secondary credit card I kept for emergencies. Declined. A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. This was not a banking glitch or a technical error. This was a targeted strike. I paid for the gas using the emergency $100 bill tucked inside my money clip and walked quickly back to my truck, my mind racing through terrifying possibilities. Sitting in the driver's seat, I slammed the door shut, grabbed my phone, and dialed the customer service number printed on the back of my debit card. The automated system kept me on hold for what felt like an absolute eternity before finally connecting me to a human representative. I provided my Social Security number, my date of birth, and my mother's maiden name to verify my identity. The representative typed on her keyboard for a long moment, and then her voice shifted, adopting a distinctly rigid institutional tone. "I am very sorry, Mr. Hayes, but I am entirely unable to authorize any transactions or release any funds from this account. I demanded to know exactly why my own money was being held hostage without my permission." The answer she provided froze the blood in my veins. "Sir, your account was officially frozen at 9 o'clock this morning due to a legal mandate. Your son, Tyson Hayes, presented our branch manager with a medical power of attorney and a certified physician's affidavit. The affidavit declares that you are suffering from severe, rapidly advancing dementia and are legally incompetent to manage your own financial affairs." I lowered the phone slowly, the line going dead. They had not just stolen my house. They had erased my legal existence. I drove back to the house in a state of hyper-focused clarity. The sheer panic that should have completely destroyed me had instead mutated into a cold, calculated rage. I parked my rusted Ford in the driveway and walked up to my front door. The physical toll of the chaotic day was finally catching up with me. I had not eaten a single thing since a piece of dry toast early that morning. The emotional whiplash of grieving my wife, discovering a multi-million-dollar tech hub empire hidden in my name, and learning my own son had legally declared me insane, left my stomach hollow and aching with sharp hunger pangs. All I wanted was to step into my kitchen and heat up a bowl of the leftover chicken stew Evelyn had made and frozen just before she passed. It was a small comfort, a quiet way to ground myself in this escalating nightmare. I pushed through the front door, the familiar creak of the hinges offering no solace today. I walked straight into the kitchen, dropping my keys on the counter, and pulled open the heavy door of the refrigerator. The blast of cold air hit my face, but the shelves were completely bare. Not a single apple, not a carton of milk, not even a plastic bottle of water remained. The glass shelves had been wiped down with harsh chemical bleach, the stinging scent of chlorine erasing any trace that a loving family had ever lived and eaten here. I stood there staring into the bright, empty void of the appliance, my brain struggling to process the sheer visual shock of it. I quickly opened the pantry doors, stripped bare. The canned goods, the bags of rice, the coffee beans I ground every morning, all gone. A heavy rustling sound drew my attention to the dining room. Madison stepped out from behind the corner, dragging a massive black industrial trash bag behind her. She was wearing thick yellow rubber gloves, her face twisted in a mask of performative concern, mixed with absolute disdain. I looked from the empty refrigerator to the bulging trash bag she held in her grip. She had thrown away everything. Hundreds of dollars worth of groceries, the meals Evelyn had meticulously prepped with her own dying hands, my basic means of survival. All of it was sitting in the garbage, destined for the landfill. "What are you doing in my house, Madison?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady. She sighed heavily, peeling off one of her rubber gloves with a dramatic snap. "Vincent, we have to be responsible now," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension one might use on a disobedient toddler. "The physician Tyson spoke with was very clear about the rapid progression of your condition. Dementia patients frequently lose their sense of taste and smell. They often consume spoiled or expired food and end up hospitalized with severe food poisoning. Tyson and I simply cannot risk leaving you alone with a fully stocked kitchen. It is a massive liability. We are doing this for your own safety to ensure you do not hurt yourself." The lie was so polished, so effortlessly cruel that it took my breath away. She was not protecting me from expired food. She had thrown away perfectly good canned vegetables, sealed pasta, and fresh fruit. This was a calculated medieval siege. By freezing my bank accounts and stripping my home of every single edible item, she and my son were intentionally starving me. They wanted to break my physical strength and my mental endurance. They wanted to make my home so unlivable, so painfully barren and hostile that I would voluntarily surrender and beg to be taken to the nursing ward long before the 7-day eviction notice expired. It was a brutal psychological tactic designed to humiliate an old man into absolute submission. The hunger in my gut twisted into a knot of pure fire. I could have shouted. I could have grabbed that heavy trash bag and thrown it out the front door with her attached to it. But anger is exactly what she wanted. Anger would prove their fake medical affidavit right. A loud, aggressive outburst would be recorded, twisted, and used as concrete evidence of my supposed erratic and dangerous mental state. A black man shouting at a white woman in a wealthy neighborhood was a scenario they would absolutely weaponize against me. I forced my breathing to slow down. I let my shoulders slump forward, purposely mimicking the defeated, confused posture of a broken elder. "I see," I murmured quietly, staring blankly at the hardwood floor. "Thank you for looking out for me, Madison." She smiled, a triumphant, predatory smirk spreading across her face. She was clearly thrilled that I had folded so easily under her pressure. "I am glad you understand, Vincent," she said, grabbing her designer purse. "Drink some tap water if you get thirsty. We will bring you a pre-approved nutritional shake tomorrow morning." She turned on her heels and walked out the front door, leaving me completely alone in my empty, starving home. As soon as her luxury SUV pulled out of the driveway, my posture straightened. The act was over. Before my decades working at the printing press, long before Tyson was even born, I worked as a communications and surveillance technician for the military. I knew hardware, and I knew how to watch an enemy without them ever knowing. Evelyn always playfully called me paranoid for keeping my old tactical gear locked away in the basement, but today, that paranoia was going to save my life. I walked purposefully into my home office. I bypassed the main desk and went straight to the heavy oak bookshelf lined with classic literature. I reached for a thick leather-bound dictionary, opening the hollowed-out center. Inside rested a small black metal protective case. I opened it and extracted a micro-button camera, a device no larger than a dime, along with a tiny wireless audio transmitter. I spent the next 20 minutes wiring the camera directly into the spine of a dark encyclopedia on the middle shelf, giving it a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire room and the hallway beyond. I carefully hid the power ribbon along the back edge of the wood and synced the audio and video feeds directly to a secure encrypted application on my smartphone. I tested the connection, ensuring the high-definition feed was crystal clear and the microphone picked up even the slightest whisper. I retreated to my bedroom upstairs, locking the door behind me. I ignored the sharp hunger pains radiating through my abdomen and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, my eyes glued to the glowing screen of my phone. 2 excruciating hours passed. The house remained dead silent. Finally, the front door unlocked. Tyson walked in alone. He paced down the hallway and stepped directly into the field of view of my hidden camera in the study. He held his cell phone tightly to his ear, his voice echoing clearly through the transmitter directly into my earpiece. "Yes, Arthur, I promise you," Tyson said, his tone dripping with a pathetic, groveling desperation to please his wealthy father-in-law. "Do not worry. Madison cleared out the entire kitchen today. The bank accounts are completely locked down. He has absolutely no access to cash and no food. Give it 48 hours. Once the hunger really sets in, the old black man will break. He will beg us to take him to the ward just to get a warm meal. As soon as he signs the medical surrender forms, the title of the house legally transfers to me. I will sign the deed over to your company by Friday morning, and you can bulldoze this dump to break ground on your new luxury condo project." I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, the devastating truth washing over me like a bucket of ice water. Tyson was not just evicting me. He was actively trading his childhood home, the very walls his mother had meticulously decorated and cherished for decades, to his father-in-law. He was selling my legacy, my history, and my dignity to a man who despised us all to earn a pathetic seat at a table that would never respect him. They wanted to steal my small home to build their condos. But they had absolutely no idea that I held the keys to Cottage 42. They wanted to starve me out, but they were about to walk right into a trap they could never escape. The morning sun brought absolutely no warmth to my empty house. My stomach roared with a sharp, hollow ache, a harsh physical reminder of Madison's cruel starvation tactics. But the fire burning inside my mind completely overpowered the hunger. I had spent the entire night sitting in the dark, mapping out every single angle of my retaliation. Just before 10 o'clock, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the front door. I dragged my feet, purposely slowing my pace to match the profile they expected, and pulled the heavy door open. Standing on my porch was a tall, sharply dressed white man in his late 40s. He wore a pristine, clinical white lab coat draped over a tailored dress shirt and an expensive silk tie. His hair was perfectly slicked back, and he offered me a practiced, entirely synthetic smile. "Good morning, Vincent," he said, stepping over the threshold without waiting for an invitation. "I am Dr. Harrison. Madison and Tyson sent me to conduct a routine wellness evaluation to ensure you are coping safely in your current environment." I stared at him, keeping my expression perfectly blank. A psychiatrist making random house calls on a Tuesday morning was highly irregular, but I knew exactly what this was. This was the final nail they were trying to hammer into my coffin. Tyson and Madison needed a verified medical professional to officially sign off on my permanent transfer to the locked nursing ward. I stepped aside, letting my shoulders slump forward, and ushered him into the living room, playing the part of the broken, compliant elder to absolute perfection. He sat down on my favorite armchair, placing a heavy premium leather briefcase on the floor right next to his polished shoes. He pulled out a thick clipboard and a sleek silver fountain pen, crossing his legs with an air of absolute authority. "Let us start with something very simple, Vincent." He began, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "Have you been remembering to eat properly? Madison mentioned you have been severely neglecting your nutrition since your wife passed away." I looked him dead in the eye and spoke clearly. "I have not eaten anything because my daughter-in-law came into my kitchen yesterday and threw all of my fresh food into a garbage bag." The man did not blink. He did not ask for clarification, nor did he show a single ounce of concern for an elderly man stating he was being starved in his own home. Instead, he clicked his silver pen and began writing rapidly on his form. I shifted my weight slightly, straining my eyes to get a better angle on his clipboard. In bold, dark ink, he had written that the patient exhibits severe paranoia, invents malicious delusions regarding family members, and suffers from acute eating aversions. He looked back up, his smile completely unchanged. "And what year is it, Vincent? Do you know who the president is?" "Can you tell me what city you are in?" I answered him correctly without a single moment of hesitation. I gave him the exact date, the time of day, and a brief summary of the morning financial news I had heard on the radio before Evelyn passed. Again, he scribbled furiously on his clipboard. "Patient demonstrates aggressive overcompensation to mask severe cognitive gaps," he wrote. "Short-term memory is critically impaired." It was a flawless, terrifying trap. It simply did not matter what I said or how rationally I behaved. The outcome of this medical evaluation had been purchased and finalized long before he ever knocked on my front door. He was not listening to a word I said. He was building a bulletproof legal profile to completely strip away my human rights, reducing me to an incompetent ward of the state. He asked me about Evelyn. He asked if I still expected her to walk through the door, deliberately attempting to twist my fresh, agonizing grief into a symptom of psychotic delusion. Every single question was a loaded weapon perfectly designed to corner me into a fabricated diagnosis of severe dementia. I knew I could not simply throw him out of my house. If I refused the evaluation, he would legally document me as hostile, violently uncooperative, and a danger to myself, which would only expedite Tyson's application for emergency legal guardianship. I needed to turn the tables. I needed to see exactly what was hiding inside that premium leather briefcase resting by his feet. I needed concrete physical proof of this conspiracy. I slowly stood up, letting my knees buckle just a fraction of an inch to sell the performance of a frail, deteriorating old man. "Dr. Harrison," I murmured, my voice shaking with perfect vulnerability. "My throat is terribly dry. I am going to the kitchen to pour myself a mug of hot water. Would you care for one?" He waved his hand dismissively, his eyes fixed on his fraudulent paperwork. "No thank you, Vincent. Just hurry back. We have a lot of ground to cover today." I walked into the kitchen, turned on the tap, and filled a heavy ceramic mug with boiling hot water from the dispenser. I took a deep breath, shifting my mindset from a grieving widower back to the tactical military communications specialist I used to be. I walked back into the living room, amplifying the tremor in my hands until the heavy mug rattled violently. As I approached his chair, I intentionally hooked the toe of my heavy work boot under the raised edge of the woven area rug. I lunged forward, letting out a startled gasp, and launched the heavy ceramic mug directly at his lap. The scalding hot water splashed violently over his expensive tailored slacks and the pristine white fabric of his lab coat. He leaped out of the armchair like he had been struck by lightning, his professional facade instantly shattering into a million pieces. He let out a loud, vicious curse, his face turning bright red with sudden, unfiltered fury. "You clumsy old fool!" he shouted frantically, brushing at the soaking wet fabric clinging to his legs. "Look what you have done to me!" I retreated instantly, bringing my hands to my face in a flawless display of senile panic and fear. "I am so sorry, doctor," I stammered, my voice trembling with fake terror. My hands just gave out. "I am so clumsy." "The bathroom is right down the hall to the left. There are fresh, dry towels in the bottom cabinet." He glared at me with absolute disgust, treating me exactly the way Madison did, like a worthless piece of trash. He muttered harsh insults under his breath as he stomped aggressively down the hallway, leaving wet footprints on my hardwood floor. The second the bathroom door slammed shut and the loud sound of running water echoed through the wall, my terrified posture vanished entirely. My spine straightened, my hands stopped shaking. I moved with silent, lethal efficiency. I dropped to my knees beside his armchair and grabbed the premium leather briefcase. The brass latches popped open with a soft, satisfying click. I bypassed the top layer of fraudulent psychiatric forms and dug my fingers directly into the inner zippered pocket. I pulled out a sleek, heavy stock business card. I held it up to the light coming through the window, my jaw tightening into a rock-hard line. The card did not bear the medical crest of a psychiatric board. It did not say, "Medical Doctor, Clinical Specialist, or Psychiatrist." It bore a sleek, modern corporate logo, Arthur Holdings and Development. Below the logo was his real name and his actual title, Senior Real Estate Appraiser. The man currently wiping hot water off his pants in my bathroom was not a doctor at all. He was a direct employee of Madison's wealthy, racist father. He had been sent here to measure the interior dimensions of my house for a demolition appraisal, while simultaneously forging a legal psychiatric hold. The entire medical mandate keeping me locked out of my bank accounts, the official affidavit that labeled me clinically insane, it was all completely fabricated by a corporate property developer. My medical record was an absolute fake. They had built their entire foundation on a massive coordinated federal crime. I slipped the card into my pocket and silently snapped the briefcase shut. They thought they were burying a helpless old man. But now I held the exact weapon I needed to tear their entire empire straight down to the ground. I slipped the real estate appraiser's business card deep into my pocket, just as the fake doctor hurried out of my bathroom, his pants still damp. He stormed out of my house without another word, completely unaware that he had just handed me the key to his employer's absolute destruction. I spent the next few hours sitting quietly in my favorite armchair, listening through the hidden camera feed as Madison made a celebratory phone call. She invited her parents over for dinner that evening, giddy with the belief that my medical surrender was virtually guaranteed. Right at 6 o'clock, a massive black luxury SUV pulled into my driveway, parking directly over the flower beds Evelyn had painstakingly cultivated for over a decade. The heavy car doors slammed and in walked Madison's parents. Arthur, her father, was a broad-shouldered, red-faced man who carried his immense wealth like a loaded weapon. He stepped through my front door without knocking, not bothering to wipe his expensive leather loafers on the welcome mat. But Arthur and his wife did not come alone. Trailing closely behind them was a young man in a high-visibility vest carrying a clipboard and a sophisticated laser measuring device. They were not here for a family dinner. They were here to appraise the demolition of my home while I was still standing inside it. Arthur walked through my hallway with the arrogant, unbothered stride of a conqueror claiming new territory. He pointed a thick gold-ringed finger at the archway leading to the kitchen. "We are going to have to rip this entire load-bearing wall out, Tyson." Arthur boomed, his voice echoing disrespectfully through the quiet house. "The foundation on these old properties is absolute garbage. We will bulldoze the entire lot by next month and start pouring concrete for the underground parking garage." The surveyor immediately began firing his laser measure against the walls, the sharp red dot dancing across the framed photographs of my late wife. I stood quietly in the corner of the living room, forcing my posture to remain hunched and fragile. I watched my son Tyson follow his father-in-law around like an obedient dog. Tyson nodded enthusiastically at every insulting critique Arthur made about the house, desperately eager to please the wealthy white man who held the keys to his fake high-society lifestyle. They brought expensive catered food from a high-end Italian restaurant downtown, spreading the containers across Evelyn's beautiful mahogany dining table without even using coasters. They sat down to eat, completely ignoring my presence, treating me like an invisible ghost haunting a house I no longer owned. I remained standing near the kitchen entrance, playing the part of the confused, starving elder. Halfway through the meal, Arthur let out a loud, irritated sigh. He dropped his silver fork onto his plate and glared at Madison. "I specifically asked you to bring that imported German craft beer I like," he grumbled, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. Madison immediately looked flustered, apologizing profusely. Arthur waved her off and slowly turned his heavy, arrogant gaze toward me. He looked at me not as a father-in-law, not as a homeowner, and certainly not as an equal. He looked at me the exact same way one looks at a stray dog that has wandered too close to the dinner table. "Hey, old man," Arthur barked, snapping his fingers in my direction to get my attention. "Make yourself useful for once." He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. But he did not hand it to me. He did not extend his arm or offer basic human decency. Instead, Arthur maintained unblinking eye contact with me, smirked, and intentionally dropped the crumpled bill directly onto the hardwood floor by his feet. "Go down to the corner store and fetch me a 6-pack of imported lager," Arthur ordered, leaning back in my dining chair. "Keep the change. Consider it a parting gift. You might as well get some fresh air before they lock you up in the memory ward tomorrow." The room went completely dead silent. Madison smirked behind her wineglass, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my absolute humiliation. But my eyes immediately locked onto Tyson. I stared directly at my son, the boy I had sacrificed my youth to protect. I waited for him to stand up. I waited for him to push his chair back, look his father-in-law in the eye, and demand respect for the man who gave him his life. I waited for a single ounce of loyalty, a single shred of the dignity I had tried so hard to instill in him. Tyson gripped his fork so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. The muscles in his jaw locked and a thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He knew this was wrong. He knew it was a vile, racist, degrading display of power. But the ambition in his heart was far stronger than the love for his father. Tyson slowly lowered his head, completely avoiding my gaze, and took a quiet bite of his food. He said absolutely nothing. He chose his father-in-law's money over my humanity. In that brief, devastating moment, the very last thread of paternal affection I held for my son snapped cleanly in two. The boy I raised was officially dead to me. Only a greedy, cowardly stranger remained sitting at my table. I did not yell. I did not flip the table or curse Arthur's name. A true tactician never alerts the enemy when they are walking straight into a minefield. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. I slowly shuffled forward, my knees popping as I bent down toward the floor. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the crumpled $20 bill from the toes of Arthur's leather shoes. "Right away, sir," I murmured in a weak, submissive whisper. "I will go get your drinks right now." Arthur laughed out loud, a booming, arrogant sound that echoed off the walls. "Good boy," he mocked, turning his attention back to his expensive pasta. "See, Tyson, you just have to know how to manage them." I turned my back on the table, grabbed my heavy winter coat from the rack, and walked out the front door into the freezing night air. The second the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, the frail, trembling old man completely vanished. My spine snapped perfectly straight. My breathing steadied into a calm, predatory rhythm. I smoothed out the crumpled $20 bill in my hand, a cold, ruthless smile spreading across my face. Arthur thought he was humiliating me, but he had just financed my ride to his absolute destruction. I did not walk toward the corner liquor store. I marched straight down to the main boulevard and raised my hand. A bright yellow taxi pulled over to the curb immediately. I climbed into the back seat, the warmth of the heater a sharp contrast to the freezing wind outside. "Take me downtown," I told the driver, my voice ringing with crystal-clear authority. "The corporate law offices on 5th Avenue. Step on it." The driver nodded and merged quickly into the evening traffic. I sat back against the leather seat, staring out the window as the bright city lights blurred past. I thought about Evelyn. I thought about the decades of quiet dignity she and I had maintained in a world that constantly tried to push us to the absolute bottom. We had played by the rules. We had kept our heads down. But Arthur and Madison believed their skin color and their bank accounts gave them the inherent right to trample all over my life. They were entirely blinded by their own privilege. 20 minutes later, the taxi pulled up to a towering skyscraper made of dark reflective glass. I handed the driver Arthur's $20 bill, added a generous tip from my own hidden money clip, and stepped out onto the pristine sidewalk. I walked through the revolving glass doors and approached the security desk. I did not have an appointment, but I did not need one. The man I was here to see owed his entire career to a massive favor Evelyn and I had done for him 30 years ago, when he was just a struggling, hungry law student trying to start his own firm. I took the private elevator directly to the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal a massive, opulent reception area. The secretary tried to stop me, citing the late hour, but I walked straight past her desk and pushed open the heavy double doors at the end of the hallway. Sitting behind a sprawling mahogany desk was Alistair, one of the most ruthless, feared, and successful corporate attorneys in the entire state. He looked up from his paperwork, his sharp eyes narrowing in annoyance at the sudden intrusion. But the moment he recognized my face, his stern expression completely dissolved into a look of absolute shock. Vincent Alistair said, quickly pushing his chair back and standing up. "My God, it has been years. I heard about Evelyn. I am so incredibly sorry." "What are you doing here at this hour?" I did not offer small talk. I walked directly up to his polished mahogany desk. I reached into my heavy winter coat and pulled out everything. I dropped the hidden camera footage drive, the fake psychiatric evaluation forms, the real estate appraiser's corporate business card, and the exact coordinates of Cottage 42 right onto the center of his desk. The heavy thud of the flash drive echoed loudly in the quiet, luxurious office. Alistair looked down at the pile of evidence, then back up at my face. His professional instincts kicked in immediately, sensing the sheer magnitude of the legal storm resting on his desk. "What exactly am I looking at, Vincent?" he asked, his voice dropping to a serious, calculated whisper. I leaned forward, planting both of my hands firmly on his desk, staring him dead in the eye. "I am looking at a coordinated conspiracy, medical fraud, elder abuse, and a hostile takeover attempt by Arthur Holdings and Development." I said, my voice cold and sharp as a razor. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a fraction of a second before delivering the final command. "Review the files, set the net. I want that entire family left without a single penny to their names." I walked back into my house long after Arthur and his arrogant entourage had finished their catered meal and departed. The ground floor was eerily quiet. The remnants of their feast still cluttered Evelyn's beautiful mahogany dining table, a blatant sign of their total lack of respect for my home. I locked the front door, the heavy deadbolt sliding into place with a satisfying thud. My meeting with Alistair had set the perfect legal trap, and a fierce righteous energy coursed through my veins. But as I ascended the wooden stairs to my second-floor bedroom, a cold, unnatural draft hit my face. I stopped on the top step. My bedroom door was wide open. I stepped inside and immediately froze. The sanctuary I had shared with Evelyn for decades had been completely ransacked. Heavy wooden drawers were pulled out of the dressers and violently dumped onto the floor. Evelyn's neatly folded sweaters, her delicate scarves, and my old work shirts were scattered carelessly across the rug. But the true violation, the sight that made my blood boil with instant fury, was in the dark corner of the walk-in closet. The heavy vintage floor safe Evelyn had owned since the early 90s was prized open. The thick steel door hung ajar, the mechanical dial completely smashed, and the heavy locking mechanism mangled by what looked like an industrial crowbar. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. There was no money in that safe. Evelyn and I did not keep liquid cash lying around the house. But she did keep highly sensitive personal documents there, things she guarded with her absolute life. I slowly scanned the destroyed room, listening closely. I heard sharp, hushed voices coming from Tyson's old childhood bedroom down the hall. I crept silently down the corridor, placing my boots carefully on the outer edges of the floorboards to avoid making a single creaking sound. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. I leaned forward and peered through the narrow gap. Madison was furiously pacing the length of the room, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. In her hands, she clutched a thick, faded manila folder. I recognized it instantly. It was the exact same folder I had seen Evelyn lock away years ago, claiming it was just old tax returns she needed to archive. Tyson was sitting on the edge of his old twin bed, his head buried deep in his hands, looking entirely defeated and pathetically small. Madison suddenly stopped pacing and slammed the heavy folder down onto the small wooden desk. "I cannot believe you, Tyson," she hissed, her voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated venom. "You walk around my family acting like you are some brilliant investment prodigy. You play the big shot for my father, drinking his scotch and pretending you belong in our world. But you are nothing but a common, dirty thief." I strained to listen, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. Madison yanked a thick sheaf of papers from the folder and shoved them aggressively into Tyson's face. $200,000, Tyson. You embezzled $200,000 from your first corporate accounting firm 5 years ago. You systematically falsified their financial records. You committed felony wire fraud. Tyson shrank back, his voice a pathetic trembling whine. "Keep your voice down, Madison, please. If anyone hears you, my career is completely over." I was desperate back then. I had terrible debts from bad investments, and I needed to clear them before I asked you to marry me. I planned to put the money back. I swear I did. Madison let out a harsh, mocking laugh that chilled the room. "You planned to put it back. You did not put a single dime back. Your precious mommy did." I watched in absolute shock, my breath catching in my throat as Madison read aloud from the highlighted documents. Evelyn had quietly liquidated a substantial portion of her personal premarital stock portfolio. She had hired a discreet corporate attorney and drafted a highly confidential restitution agreement with Tyson's former employer. She paid back every single stolen cent plus massive legal penalties just to keep them from pressing criminal charges and ruining his life. Evelyn had done all of this entirely behind my back to keep her only son out of a federal penitentiary. The sheer magnitude of the secret staggered me. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. My beautiful, fiercely moral wife had compromised her own pristine integrity and drained her hard-earned resources to save a son who did not deserve a fraction of her grace. She carried that heavy, agonizing burden completely alone, shielding me from the heartbreaking reality that the boy I raised was a white-collar criminal. She died carrying his shame. And now Madison was weaponizing Evelyn's ultimate sacrifice. Madison grabbed the thick stack of embezzlement records, reared her hand back, and struck Tyson forcefully across the face with them. The sharp, stinging crack of paper hitting flesh echoed loudly in the small room. "You are an absolute fraud!" She spat, her pale eyes blazing with a terrifying, calculated malice. You are exceptionally lucky my father does not know about this. If he finds out he let a convicted felon marry his daughter, if he discovers your entire background is built on stolen corporate funds, he will legally and financially ruin you. He will strip you of your position at the firm, and I will divorce you so fast your head will spin. Tyson rubbed his reddened cheek, looking up at his wife with pure, unmasked terror. Madison, I beg you. You cannot show those documents to anyone. It will destroy absolutely everything we have built. I will lose my job. I will go to prison. Madison leaned in close, her posture dominant, her tone turning into a razor-sharp, uncompromising command. Then you do exactly what I tell you to do. Your father has proven he is a completely unpredictable liability today. He wandered off tonight like a stray animal, embarrassing my father in the process. I am entirely done waiting out this ridiculous 7-day eviction period. I want him out of this house, and I want him locked away where he cannot cause any more problems. I have the emergency guardianship surrender papers right here in my bag. I want him permanently locked in that psychiatric memory ward by tomorrow morning. You are going to go downstairs and force him to sign these medical surrender forms tonight. I do not care what you have to say to him. If he refuses, you will physically forge his signature yourself. Get it done, Tyson. Do it right now or I walk straight into the police precinct tomorrow morning with your mother's secret file and have you arrested for grand larceny. I stood perfectly still in the dark hallway, watching my son through the narrow crack in the door. My heart felt like a solid block of ice. I waited to see if there was a single ounce of backbone left in his body. I waited to see if he would finally stand up to the cruel, manipulative woman who was actively blackmailing him. I prayed deep in my soul that he would draw a line, that he would finally refuse to sacrifice his own father to protect his fabricated life. But Tyson simply crumbled. He did not fight back. He did not defend me. His shoulders shook as a pathetic, cowardly sob escaped his lips. He looked at the blank guardianship papers sticking out of Madison's bag, then at the damning embezzlement files in her hand. He slowly nodded his head, his voice dropping to a defeated, barely audible whisper. Okay. I will make him sign it. I will do whatever you want. Just please keep the file hidden. I stepped back from the door, a chilling numbness spreading through every single nerve in my body. It was the absolute ultimate betrayal from my own flesh and blood. Tyson had formally agreed to end my life just to save his own skin. I retreated from the dark hallway and walked silently back downstairs to the living room. I positioned myself in my favorite armchair directly in the clear line of sight of the hidden micro camera I had wired into the bookshelf earlier that afternoon. I did not have to wait long. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs. Tyson descended, his face pale and slick with a nervous, guilty sweat. He marched into the living room, clutching the thick stack of legal documents Madison had demanded he force upon me. He threw the psychiatric guardianship surrender forms onto the coffee table right in front of me, accompanied by a cheap plastic pen. "Sign it, Dad," he demanded, his voice cracking slightly, despite his desperate attempt to sound authoritative and tough. "We are done playing games tonight. You are not safe here, and you are going to a secure facility immediately." I looked at the fraudulent papers, then slowly looked up at the pathetic broken man standing before me. I did not reach for the pen. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands calmly across my chest. "I will not sign anything." "Tyson?" I replied, my voice a calm, unwavering baritone that filled the quiet room. "You are selling your own father down the river to protect a lie. You let that woman hold a tight leash around your neck just to save your fabricated career. I am not going anywhere, and I will absolutely not sign away my life and my freedom just because you lack the spine to stand up to your wife." Tyson stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides, desperation and fear completely overtaking him. "You do not have a choice," he hissed, leaning over me with a pathetic display of intimidation. Before Tyson could utter another empty threat, the rapid, aggressive clicking of designer heels descended the staircase. Madison stormed into the living room, her face flushed with absolute fury. She had been listening from the upstairs landing, and she realized her cowardly husband was failing to secure my signature. "If you cannot handle a senile old man, Tyson, I will handle it myself," she spat, grabbing the papers and the pen from the coffee table. She stood directly in front of me, her pale eyes wide, cold, and calculating. "Sign the papers, Vincent, or I will personally make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a state penitentiary instead of a private nursing home." I looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. "You have absolutely no power here, Madison," I said evenly. "You are standing in my house threatening me over a fabricated medical diagnosis that your father paid for. I am not signing those papers, and there is nothing you can do to force my hand." Her expression shifted instantly. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a dark, terrifying malice. She looked at me, then looked toward the large bay window facing the quiet suburban street outside. "Oh, Vincent," she whispered, her voice dropping to a sinister, breathy pitch. "You really have no idea how the real world works, do you?" In a sudden, violent blur of motion, Madison grabbed the collar of her expensive silk blouse. With a harsh, sickening, tearing sound, she ripped the fabric straight down the middle, exposing her collarbone and the top of her chest. Tyson gasped, stepping back in complete shock, his eyes wide with horror. "What are you doing?" he stammered helplessly. Madison ignored him entirely. She raised her right hand, dug her perfectly manicured fingernails deep into the bare skin of her left forearm, and dragged them down with brutal, vicious force. Bright red scratches welled up instantly, heavy drops of blood pooling on her pale skin. She did it again to her own neck, creating horrific, violent red marks that looked like she had been choked. My heart slammed against my ribs as the realization of her truly diabolical plan hit me. She turned on her heels, sprinted toward the front door, threw it wide open, and rushed out onto the front porch into the freezing night. "Help me!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice completely hysterical and shattering the quiet suburban neighborhood. "Somebody please help me. He is going crazy. He is attacking me. He has a weapon. Please, somebody call the police right now. The old man has completely lost his mind." The chill of the winter air rushing through the open door was absolutely nothing compared to the freezing terror that gripped my soul. I knew exactly what she was doing. In this country, the dynamic she was actively exploiting was a lethal weapon. A young, hysterical white woman standing on a porch with torn clothes and bleeding scratches, screaming that an older black man was violently attacking her inside a house, was not just a domestic dispute. It was a guaranteed death sentence without a trial. History and society had hardwired the world to view me as the immediate, undeniable threat in this exact scenario. If the authorities arrived and found her bleeding on my front lawn, my age, my pristine record, and my innocence would not matter in the slightest. I would be tackled, brutalized, or shot before I even had the chance to speak a single word in my own defense. Madison knew exactly what buttons to push. She was weaponizing her race and her gender to completely annihilate me, fully aware that the police would shoot first and ask questions later. Her blood-curdling screams functioned exactly as she intended. Across the street porch, lights began snapping on one by one in rapid succession. Front doors creaked open, and cautious neighbors stepped out onto their manicured lawns, their faces pale in the moonlight, as they tried to locate the source of the horrific screaming. Mr. Davis, a hostile neighbor from the corner who had never liked Evelyn and me, marched out of his house holding a heavy tactical flashlight. He shined the blinding beam directly onto my front porch, illuminating Madison's torn clothes. I saw him grab his cell phone and dial frantically, shouting into the receiver. Madison collapsed onto the wooden steps of my porch, weeping hysterically, clutching her torn blouse together as if she were desperately protecting herself from a monster. "He tried to hurt me," she sobbed loudly to the gathering crowd of onlookers. "He does not know who he is anymore. He just snapped and came at me." Within less than 2 minutes, the unmistakable piercing wail of police sirens pierced the suburban quiet. The high-pitched screaming of the sirens grew louder and more aggressive by the second, echoing off the houses like hunting dogs closing in on their prey as multiple patrol cars sped toward my address. The flashing red and blue lights began to bounce off the walls of my living room, painting the space in the chaotic colors of an impending disaster. Tyson practically leaped away from the window, his entire body shaking with absolute, uncontrolled panic. The police were seconds away, and he knew exactly how volatile and deadly this situation was about to become for me. He scrambled back to the coffee table, snatched the psychiatric surrender forms and the pen, and shoved them violently into my chest. "Dad, please, you have to sign this right now," Tyson pleaded, hot tears of pure terror streaming down his face. "If the cops walk in here and see her bleeding and crying, they will shoot you. They will drag you away in handcuffs and lock you in a cell forever. Sign the medical release right now. If you are legally documented as a dementia patient having a medical episode, the police will go easy on you. They will just take you to the hospital in an ambulance instead of taking you to jail. Please, Dad, just sign the paper to save your own life." I looked at my son's panicked, sweaty face. He was still trying to manipulate me using his wife's psychotic racist trap to force my hand. I looked past him, watching the flashing red and blue police lights illuminating the dark room. I did not take the pen. Instead, I looked directly into the lens of the hidden micro camera I had installed in the bookshelf earlier that day, knowing it was securely recording and transmitting every single second of this interaction to a remote server. I leaned back in my chair, crossed my legs calmly, and smiled a cold, victorious smile. "Let them come in," I said softly. The front door burst open with a terrifying, violent force that shook the very foundation of my home. Heavy combat boots stomped aggressively onto my hardwood floors. "Police, show me your hands. Do not move a single muscle." The shouting was absolutely deafening, overlapping with the erratic, high-pitched squawking of police radios and the blinding glare of tactical flashlights sweeping wildly across my living room. 3 armed officers stormed into the space with their weapons drawn, their eyes wide and completely adrenalized by the dispatch call. Behind them, hovering safely in the doorway, Madison was putting on the theatrical performance of a lifetime. She sobbed uncontrollably, clutching the torn pieces of her expensive silk blouse together, pointing a trembling, blood-stained finger directly at my chest. "He went completely crazy. He tried to kill me," she wailed, her voice echoing out into the quiet suburban night for all the gathered neighbors to hear. "He does not know who he is anymore. Please, you have to protect me." Tyson stood frozen in the corner of the room, his hands raised high in the air, his face completely pale. He was too terrified to speak a single word in my defense, perfectly willing to let the police gun down his own father to protect his wife's psychotic narrative. The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern jaw, trained his weapon squarely on my chest. The tension in the room was absolute and suffocating. I knew the dark, tragic history of this exact scenario. One wrong move, one sudden twitch, one raised voice, and my life would end right there in the very house Evelyn and I had built. But I did not panic. I kept my breathing remarkably slow and steady. I kept my hands resting palms up on my knees, completely visible, completely empty, and completely still. I looked directly at the lead officer with the calm, disciplined gaze of a man who had faced far worse adversaries and far more dangerous situations in his lifetime. "Officer," I said. My voice was deeply resonant, remarkably calm, and perfectly measured. I did not raise my pitch. I did not sound defensive or panicked. "I am the homeowner. I am entirely unarmed. I am not moving." The lead officer kept his weapon raised, his intense eyes scanning the room for the weapon Madison had completely fabricated. "Stand up very slowly and face the wall," he commanded harshly. I did exactly as I was told. I moved with deliberate, exaggerated slowness, ensuring my hands never dropped below my waist. "He is incredibly dangerous. He does not know what he is doing." Madison shrieked from the hallway, aggressively pushing the false narrative of my supposed severe dementia. He attacked me out of nowhere. I faced the floral wallpaper, feeling the cold, hard reality of the moment. The officer approached me carefully, patted me down for weapons, and found absolutely nothing. "Sir, what exactly happened here tonight?" The officer asked, his tone slightly less aggressive, now that he realized I was just a quiet senior citizen wearing a cardigan. "Officer, my daughter-in-law is actively attempting to force me into a psychiatric facility so she can steal my home and my assets," I replied clearly, turning my head just slightly to address him respectfully. I did not lay a single finger on her. She tore her own clothing and scratched her own arms to create a false domestic violence scene. Madison gasped loudly, a sound of pure manufactured outrage. "He is lying. He is completely delusional." I ignored her entirely and focused my attention completely on the badge standing in front of me. "I am a retired military communications technician," Officer I stated smoothly. I fully anticipated this exact threat from them. If you look at the second shelf of the oak bookcase to your left, you will see a dark blue encyclopedia. I embedded a high-definition micro camera into its spine this afternoon. The officer frowned deeply, looking over his shoulder toward the bookshelf. "My unlocked smartphone is sitting face up on the coffee table right behind you," I continued, keeping my tone perfectly respectful and cooperative. "The surveillance application is currently open on the screen. It recorded every single second of this incident with crystal clear audio and high-definition video. Please, officer, just look at the footage. It will tell you exactly who the violent criminal in this room truly is." The lead officer gave me a long, calculating look. He signaled for his partner to keep a hand near his holster, then walked over to the coffee table. He picked up my smartphone. The second he touched the screen, Madison instantly stopped her theatrical sobbing. The sudden deafening silence from the hallway was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The officer stared intently at the glowing screen. He tapped the playback button. I stood quietly against the wall, listening to the tiny tinny speaker on my phone broadcast the damning, undeniable reality of the situation. The audio played Madison's own voice, loud, cruel, and perfectly clear. "Sign the papers. Vincent or I will personally make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a state penitentiary." Then came the sharp, unmistakable sound of tearing fabric. The officer watched the high-definition footage of Madison aggressively ripping her own expensive silk blouse straight down the middle. He watched her dig her perfectly manicured nails deep into her own skin, purposefully drawing her own blood before turning and sprinting out the front door to scream for help. The officer slowly lowered my phone. The entire atmosphere in the living room shifted violently. The blinding adrenaline of a potential violent crime scene evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold, hard, crushing weight of the undeniable truth. The lead officer holstered his weapon. He turned around and walked straight toward the hallway where Madison was standing. His face was like carved stone, his eyes burning with professional outrage. "Ma'am," the officer barked, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You just staged a violent felony. You filed a false police report, wasted emergency city resources, and attempted to frame an innocent elderly man in his own home." Madison turned completely white. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a ghost. "No, you do not understand," she stammered, stepping backward toward the porch, her fake tears entirely gone. "The video is out of context. He is legally incompetent. My father has the paperwork." The officer stepped forward, pointing a stern, unwavering finger directly in her face. "Do not say another word to me. You are incredibly lucky I cannot arrest you on the spot without a detective processing the extortion and fraud charges first. But I am filing a full detailed report tonight, and this video evidence is going straight to the district attorney. You are trespassing. Get out of this house immediately. If I ever get called to this address for you again, you will leave the premises in handcuffs." Tyson was trembling so violently he had to lean against the hallway wall to keep his legs from collapsing underneath him. His wife's diabolical racist trap had spectacularly backfired, and they were now both standing directly in the crosshairs of the local police department. The lead officer turned back to me. His posture relaxed, and his tone completely transformed into one of genuine professional respect. "Sir, you are safe here. You can sit down. We are clearing these two out of your house right now." The police escorted them aggressively toward the front door, forcing them out into the freezing night. Madison realized she had completely lost control of the narrative. The victim act vanished entirely, replaced by the ugly, venomous reality of who she truly was. She pulled away from the officer's grip just as she reached the threshold. She whipped her head around to look at me, her pale eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you won, you old fool," she screamed, her voice completely unhinged and echoing out to the neighbors watching from their lawns. "This house is already gone. The foreclosure paperwork was expedited yesterday morning. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, this dump goes up for a forced public auction. My father is buying it out from under you, and you will have absolutely nothing left. Prepare to sleep on the freezing street." The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, finally cutting off her hysterical, desperate shouting. I stood in my quiet living room, surrounded by the departing police officers, and let out a slow, deeply satisfied breath. Madison was right about one thing. A massive auction was happening tomorrow morning. But she was entirely, tragically wrong about who was going to end up sleeping on the street. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers finally faded into the distance, leaving my quiet suburban street bathed in the pale, freezing glow of the winter moon. It was well past midnight, and the temperature outside was dropping rapidly, a bitter frost settling heavily over the neighborhood. I walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of tap water, needing a moment to process the sheer chaos of the evening. But before my hand even reached the metal faucet, the ambient, comforting hum of the refrigerator died completely. A split second later, the overhead lights snapped off. The low, steady vibration of the central heating unit wound down to a dead mechanical halt. The house was instantly plunged into absolute pitch-black silence. I stood in the darkness, listening to the sudden quiet. I turned the handle on the kitchen sink. A short, pathetic sputter of brown water coughed out of the aerator, followed by a hollow hiss of empty air, and then nothing. The water main had been shut off. I walked over to the digital thermostat on the wall. The screen was completely dead. Madison and Tyson, humiliated, terrified, and furious after their spectacular failure with the police, had executed a deeply vindictive contingency plan. Using Tyson's knowledge of my utility accounts and his fraudulent power of attorney paperwork, they had aggressively severed the electricity, the water, and the gas lines to the house. The temperature inside the living room was already beginning to plummet. They fully expected a frail 69-year-old man to panic in the freezing dark. They wanted me to freeze to suffer and to ultimately beg for mercy before the forced public auction Madison had screamed about. They severely miscalculated. I did not panic. I did not scramble for a phone in the dark to call the utility companies and plead for an emergency reconnection. I am a man who served in the military, a veteran who survived conditions far worse, far colder, and far more hostile than a powerless house in an affluent suburb. I navigated my home in the pitch dark entirely from memory, my footsteps steady and unhurried. I walked to the hall closet and pulled out a heavy military-grade wool blanket, draping it comfortably over my broad shoulders. I moved to the living room and kneeled before the old exposed stone fireplace. Evelyn always loved the smell of a real wood fire in the dead of winter, and I always kept a large stack of seasoned oak logs split and stacked neatly in the backyard shed. Anticipating their petty, spiteful sabotage, I had brought an armful of heavy wood inside just yesterday afternoon. Working methodically in the dark, I built a perfect teepee of dry kindling and struck a single long wooden match. The dry wood caught the flame immediately. Within minutes, a warm, bright golden glow illuminated the living room, pushing back the biting cold and casting tall, dancing shadows against the floral wallpaper. I pulled my favorite armchair close to the hearth, feeling the radiant heat soak into my bones. Next, I reached into an insulated tactical bag resting beside the chair, a remnant from my service days that I still kept packed with survival supplies. I pulled out a heavy-duty steel thermos filled with boiling water I had prepared earlier that afternoon. I dropped a chamomile tea bag into a rugged camping mug, poured the steaming water, and let it steep. The sweet, calming aroma filled the freezing air. I sat back in the comforting warmth of the fire, sipping my hot tea, surrounded by absolute, unshakable tranquility. Madison and Tyson desperately wanted to break my spirit with the freezing dark. They wanted to weaponize the winter cold to force my submission. Instead, they only provided me with the most peaceful, quiet, and reflective night I had experienced since my beautiful Evelyn passed away. I watched the bright flames crackle and consume the dry wood, recognizing it as a perfect poetic metaphor for exactly what I was about to do to their entire lives. The serene silence of the room was suddenly broken by a short, sharp vibration from my smartphone resting on the coffee table. The device was fully charged, plugged directly into a high-capacity portable battery bank I kept specifically for strategic moments exactly like this. I picked it up, the bright screen cutting sharply through the dim, flickering firelight. It was a secure, encrypted text message from Alistair. I opened it, my eyes scanning the text rapidly, my tactical mind processing the incoming intelligence. Vincent, the message read, "The net is fully set." My inside contacts at Arthur Holdings and Development just confirmed their massive financial movements. Arthur is completely liquidating his company's reserve assets tonight. He is pulling every single favor, leveraging his existing commercial properties and draining his corporate accounts to pool exactly $5 million in liquid cash. His acquisitions team discovered the upcoming blind auction for the 50-acre Tech Valley parcel known as Cottage 42. Because of the brilliant proxy shell companies Evelyn used in the 80s, Arthur's legal team firmly believes the land is tied up in an abandoned, ownerless municipal trust due to a decades-old clerical error. They think they are about to steal the most valuable, highly coveted, undeveloped commercial real estate in the state for absolute pennies on the dollar. He is placing the entire $5 million into a non-refundable escrow account tomorrow morning to lock out all competing corporate bidders. The final bid is secured for the day after tomorrow. I read the message a second time to ensure I was fully processing the sheer breathtaking magnitude of their unadulterated greed. Arthur was so blinded by his own massive ambitions, so obsessed with aggressively expanding his real estate empire, that he was betting his entire corporate livelihood on a single high-stakes acquisition. He was over-leveraging his company to the absolute breaking point, borrowing against assets he barely owned just to seize what he thought was an easy multi-million-dollar prize. Madison and Tyson thought they were severely punishing me tonight. They truly believed they were going to publicly humiliate me tomorrow morning by buying my modest, sentimental little home at a forced foreclosure auction, laughing while they kicked me out onto the street. But they had absolutely no idea that their ultimate grand prize, the 50-acre Tech Valley gold mine that Arthur was currently risking $5 million of non-refundable capital to acquire legally, belonged to the very man they had just tried to freeze to death. I lowered the glowing phone to my lap and took a long, slow sip of my hot chamomile tea. A deep, resonant chuckle escaped my chest, echoing warmly and richly in the quiet, firelit room. They wanted to play dirty to steal my small memories-filled house. I was going to let them. Let them revel in their petty, hollow victory tomorrow morning. Let Madison flaunt her designer clothes and her father's checkbook. Because while they were busy fighting like scavengers over the meager scraps of my past, I was going to let them swallow a massive, lethally poisoned hook that would drag their entire arrogant empire straight down to the absolute bottom of the ocean. The sun rose over the frost-covered lawns of my neighborhood, casting a pale, freezing light through my living room window. The fire I had built the night before had burned down to glowing embers. I stood up, stretching the stiffness from my back, and prepared for my final grand performance. I stripped off my heavy wool blanket and my warm layers. I put on a pair of thin, worn-out house slippers and a light, mismatched sweater that offered absolutely no protection against the biting winter air. I messed up my hair, letting it stand wildly on end, and shuffled to the front door. I unlocked it and stepped out onto the freezing concrete of the porch. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but I ignored it. I began to wander down the driveway and into the middle of the street, dragging my feet in a perfect, pathetic shuffle. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering violently, and began to call out to the crisp morning air. "Evelyn," I murmured, my voice trembling and weak. "Evelyn, where are you? The coffee is getting cold, Evelyn." I repeated her name over and over, playing the part of a deeply confused, tragically lost elder who had completely disconnected from reality. It did not take long for my audience to arrive. Less than 15 minutes later, Tyson and Madison pulled up to the curb in her luxury SUV. They had been waiting nearby, likely circling the block, monitoring the house to see how the freezing night had broken me. When Madison saw me wandering aimlessly in the street, shivering and calling for a dead woman, a wicked, triumphant grin stretched across her face. They jumped out of the vehicle, leaving the engine running. "Look at him, Tyson," Madison sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me. "He has completely lost his mind. I told you the cold would snap whatever sanity he had left." Tyson approached me, his posture reeking of fake concern for the benefit of any neighbors peeking through their blinds. "Dad, what are you doing out here?" he asked loudly, grabbing my arm with far too much force. "You are freezing. Come on, we are getting you help right now." I leaned into the act, throwing my weight against him, my eyes darting around wildly as if I did not recognize my own son. "Where is Evelyn?" I whimpered softly. "I need to find my wife." Madison did not waste a single second. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she clearly had saved on speed dial. She was not calling the official emergency services. She was calling a private, highly questionable medical transport company that her father frequently used to quietly remove problematic individuals from his properties. "Send the transport van to the address I gave you last night," she ordered, her voice completely devoid of any human empathy. "The patient has had a full psychotic break. He requires immediate involuntary transfer to the secure psychiatric ward." We stood on the freezing sidewalk. Tyson kept a tight, aggressive grip on my bicep, treating me like a flight risk rather than a father. Within 10 minutes, an unmarked, heavy-duty white transport van sped around the corner and screeched to a halt in front of my house. Two large, imposing men wearing cheap paramedic uniforms stepped out. They carried no medical equipment, only heavy-duty restraint straps and a folding stretcher. They looked less like healthcare professionals and more like hired thugs. Madison marched right up to them, handing the driver a thick, folded envelope. I knew exactly what was inside. It was a stack of crisp, untraceable cash. Her father's money buying my swift and silent removal from society. "Take him straight to the state facility on the edge of the county," she commanded coldly. "The intake coordinator there has already been compensated. He will be processed as a permanent involuntary ward of the state." The two thugs did not say a word. They grabbed me roughly by the shoulders, not bothering with the stretcher, and physically shoved me toward the back of the transport vehicle. I stumbled forward, letting my knees buckle slightly, putting up a weak, pathetic resistance to sell the illusion. "No, please, I do not want to go," I babbled, keeping my voice shaky. The men ignored me, pushing me forcefully into the back of the transport vehicle and locking me into a rigid, uncomfortable metal seat. Tyson climbed into the back of the van with me, taking the seat directly across from mine. He wanted to personally escort me to my prison, likely terrified that I might somehow regain my composure and talk my way out of the facility. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, plunging the back of the van into a dim, claustrophobic gloom that smelled strongly of bleach and stale sweat. The engine roared and the vehicle lurched forward, driving me away from the home I had cherished for decades. For the first few minutes of the ride, I kept my head down, mumbling incoherently to myself, rocking gently back and forth. Tyson sat back against the metal wall, pulling out his smartphone, completely ignoring my supposed distress. A massive wave of relief visibly washed over his face. He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh, typing furiously on his screen. "I am sorry it had to end this way, Dad," Tyson said, his tone utterly devoid of any actual sorrow. He sounded incredibly smug, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. "But you were standing directly in the way of progress. Madison's father is closing the foreclosure auction on your house in exactly 1 hour. Everything is finalized. As soon as the deed transfers to his holding company, Arthur is wiring $1 million directly into my personal offshore account." I kept my head down, letting him talk. I wanted him to confess every single detail of his betrayal. $1 million, Dad, Tyson continued, his voice echoing in the hollow space of the moving van. "Cash. It is my cut for expediting the property surrender and getting you out of the picture. You never understood ambition. You were happy fixing gears and pinching pennies, living a completely unremarkable life. But Madison's family understands true power. I am finally going to be a partner in his firm. I am finally going to have the respect and the lifestyle I deserve. I will not be the son of a greasy mechanic anymore. I am going to be a millionaire by this afternoon, and all you had to do was get out of my way." He sat back, incredibly proud of his deceit, grinning like a man who had just won the lottery. He truly believed he had orchestrated the perfect crime. He believed he had sold his father for $1 million and secured his wealthy future. He thought I was just a broken, mindless old man sitting in the dark, entirely unaware of the world around me. I stopped rocking. I stopped mumbling. The frail, shivering persona I had meticulously maintained all morning evaporated in an absolute instant. I slowly raised my head, the dim light of the transport van catching my eyes. I locked my gaze directly onto Tyson. My posture straightened my shoulders, squaring into the rigid, commanding stance of a military veteran. The silence in the back of the van suddenly became incredibly thick, heavy, and lethal. Tyson noticed the immediate shift in my demeanor. His smug smile faltered, his brow furrowed in sudden creeping confusion as he looked at the cold, calculating expression on my face. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing a deeply dangerous shift in the atmosphere. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us, my eyes piercing right through his cowardly soul like a jagged knife. I spoke, and my voice was no longer a weak, trembling whisper. It was a deep, resonant baritone dripping with absolute terrifying authority. "Tyson," I said calmly, watching the color begin to drain rapidly from his face, "do you honestly believe that house was in your mother's name?" Tyson sat perfectly still, his eyes locked onto mine. The smug, self-satisfied grin that had been plastered across his face just seconds ago completely vanished. He blinked rapidly, his brain struggling to process the sudden jarring shift in my demeanor. The frail, shivering old man he thought he had easily conquered was gone, replaced by a rigid, commanding presence that seemed to consume the entire claustrophobic space of the transport van. "What did you just say?" Tyson asked, his voice entirely stripped of its former arrogance. I did not answer him immediately. Instead, I stood up from the uncomfortable metal bench. I did not stumble. My knees did not buckle. I walked with absolute unwavering balance toward the steel mesh partition that separated the cargo hold from the driver's cabin. I struck the metal grate with the hard, flat palm of my hand. The sound cracked like a gunshot inside the enclosed vehicle. "Pull this van over to the shoulder right now," I ordered, my voice booming with a deep, tactical authority that left absolutely no room for debate. The driver glanced back through the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed in confusion. He scoffed, ignoring my command, clearly assuming I was just another erratic patient having a delusion. "Keep driving," Tyson snapped, trying to regain control of the situation. "He is just confused." I struck the grate a second time, harder than before. "I am not confused, and if you do not pull this vehicle over in the next 5 seconds, you will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for felony kidnapping," I stated coldly. staring directly into the driver's eyes through the mirror. Look out your side mirror. Look at the sleek black town car that has been tailing you since we left my driveway. Inside that vehicle is one of the most ruthless corporate attorneys in this state. He is currently recording your license plate, your route, and the fact that you are transporting a mentally sound, legally independent citizen against his will without a single shred of legitimate medical authorization. The driver's eyes darted to his side mirror. The color drained from his face instantly. The unmarked black town car was riding their bumper, its tinted windows offering no comfort, only the promise of severe legal retribution. These hired thugs were paid to quietly transport compliant elders, not to engage in high-profile federal crimes against heavily lawyered targets. The driver cursed loudly, slammed his foot on the brake pedal, and swerved the heavy white van onto the gravel shoulder of the deserted county road. The vehicle lurched to a violent, dusty halt. Tyson was breathing heavily now, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow bursts. He looked from me to the partition and back again, sheer panic beginning to override his confusion. "Dad, what are you doing?" he demanded, his voice cracking horribly. "Stop playing these games. You signed the house over. Madison's father is closing the auction right now." I turned my back to the partition and looked down at the pathetic, sweating man who used to be my son. "You really think Evelyn and I survived 40 years in a system designed to crush us by being foolish?" I asked, my tone dripping with a quiet, lethal disappointment. "You think your mother, a woman who meticulously managed every single penny and legally protected us from redlining and predatory banks, would just leave our greatest asset exposed to probate court?" Tyson swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of his metal seat. "The deed was in her name," he stammered frantically, trying to convince himself. "I saw the county tax records. As her only child, the property naturally reverts to me. Madison's lawyers verified it. Madison's lawyers are arrogant fools who only looked at the surface-level municipal records." I corrected him, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. 10 years ago, your mother and I sat down with a specialized estate attorney. We knew the world was changing, and we knew how greedy people could become when property values in the valley started to skyrocket. Evelyn legally transferred the deed of that house and everything else we owned into an ironclad, irrevocable, blind trust. The V. Hayes Trust. Tyson's eyes widened in absolute horror. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "I am the sole acting trustee and the exclusive executor of the V. Hayes Trust." I continued, dismantling his entire master plan piece by agonizing piece. "That house does not belong to Evelyn's estate, which means it absolutely does not belong to you. You are not the legal heir to that property, Tyson. You have absolutely zero claim to the title, the land, or the equity." The silence in the back of the van was deafening. I could practically hear the gears grinding in Tyson's head as the catastrophic legal reality of his actions finally began to take hold. "Do you understand what you did this morning?" I asked softly, leaning down so my face was only inches from his. "You signed a fast cash sale agreement. You authorized a forced public auction to your father-in-law. You legally presented yourself to a buyer and to a municipal court as the sole owner of a property you have absolutely no legal right to sell. That is not just a misunderstanding, Tyson. That is textbook real estate fraud. That is criminal forgery." Tyson grabbed the sides of his head, his fingers digging into his hair. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking with pure terror. "No, the auction is happening right now. Arthur is wiring the money." "Exactly," I said, striking the final fatal blow to his ego. "Arthur is currently transferring $1 million of his company's capital into your offshore account to purchase a fraudulent deed. When you accept $1 million across international borders for a fake real estate transaction, you are no longer just committing local fraud. You are committing federal wire fraud and international money laundering. The FBI will not just freeze your accounts. They will seize every single asset you and Madison own. And when Arthur finds out that his own son-in-law orchestrated a scam that implicated his holding company in a federal money laundering scheme, he is not going to make you a partner in his firm. He is going to completely destroy you. He will throw you to the wolves to save his own reputation without batting an eye." Tyson hyperventilated. The perfectly tailored suit he wore suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He was drowning in the realization of his own spectacular failure. He had betrayed his father, sold his soul, and committed multiple federal felonies, all for a prize that never actually existed. His entire fake high society life was collapsing in real time. "What time is it?" Tyson gasped, frantically patting his pockets to find his smartphone. He pulled it out, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device on the metal floor. It was 9:15. The auction had officially opened. Arthur's financial team was actively finalizing the escrow transfers. "Open the doors!" Tyson screamed, turning toward the front grate. "Open the damn doors right now!" The thugs up front, completely terrified of the legal nightmare they had driven into, did not hesitate. The automatic locks clicked, and the heavy rear doors of the transport van swung open, letting in the biting, freezing winter air. Tyson did not even look at me. He did not apologize. He did not ask for forgiveness. His survival instinct had completely overridden whatever remaining shred of humanity he possessed. He stumbled out of the van, his expensive leather shoes hitting the gravel shoulder. "Hey, Tyson," shouted at the driver running up to the front window. "You have to take me downtown. Right now. Take me to the corporate financial district. I will pay you $10,000 cash if you get me to Arthur Holdings in the next 20 minutes. Forget the old man. Leave him here. Just drive." The driver, eager to wash his hands of the kidnapping charge, and tempted by the massive bribe, slammed the van into gear. The tires spun aggressively on the loose gravel, kicking up a cloud of dust and frost as the heavy white vehicle sped away down the empty county road, racing toward the city. I stood completely alone on the shoulder of the road. The winter wind whipped through my thin sweater and my worn-out house slippers, biting at my skin. But I did not feel the cold. I felt a deep, profound warmth radiating from the center of my chest. I had just watched my son choose his own self-preservation over my life for the final time. The ultimate confirmation that I owed him absolutely nothing. A few seconds later, the crunch of heavy tires on gravel announced the arrival of the vehicle that had been quietly trailing the transport van the entire morning. The sleek, polished black town car glided to a smooth halt directly in front of me. The engine purred silently. The tinted rear window rolled down with a soft mechanical hum. Sitting in the plush leather back seat was Alistair, impeccably dressed in a dark, bespoke suit, holding a glowing tablet in his hand. He looked at me standing on the side of the road in my ridiculous, disheveled outfit and offered a sharp, dangerous smile. "Right on schedule," Vincent Alistair said smoothly. "Your son appears to be in quite a rush." I stepped forward, opened the heavy door of the town car, and climbed into the heated, luxurious interior. I settled into the rich leather seat, the biting cold instantly replaced by a comforting, absolute warmth. I looked out the window toward the city skyline looming in the distance, where two massive, arrogant empires were currently rushing headfirst into a spectacular collision. I turned my gaze back to my oldest friend and smiled. "Let us go," I said, my voice ringing with total clarity. "The stage is set." The sleek black town car glided seamlessly through the sprawling manicured grounds of the Oak Ridge Country Club. This was a notoriously exclusive, historically restrictive establishment where the valley's wealthiest elite gathered to consolidate their power and celebrate their greed. For decades, people who looked like me were only permitted to cross these threshold gates if we were carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres, clearing the tables, or parking the luxury vehicles of the members. Today I was arriving not as a servant nor as a guest, but as the absolute executioner of their entire reality. During the swift drive from the deserted county road into the heart of the city, I had completely transformed. Alistair had anticipated every single detail of this operation. Waiting for me in the spacious rear cabin of the town car was a heavy garment bag. I had stripped off the thin, pathetic sweater and the worn-out house slippers that had served as my costume for the morning. In their place, I put on a meticulously tailored, custom-fitted $5,000 bespoke suit of midnight blue wool. I buttoned a crisp, brilliant white dress shirt and adjusted a perfectly knotted silk tie. I slid my feet into polished, handcrafted leather Oxfords. When I looked at my reflection in the tinted glass of the window, the frail, shivering dementia patient was entirely gone. Staring back at me was the formidable, razor-sharp tactician who had quietly outsmarted the most aggressive corporate predators in the state. We bypassed the main reception of the country club entirely. Alistair had coordinated this strike perfectly with the federal authorities, securing our completely unhindered entry through the private administrative corridors. I stood quietly in a shadowed, velvet-lined alcove just outside the grand ballroom, flanked by Alistair and our newly acquired escort. Through the partially open acoustic doors, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the lavish spectacle unfolding inside. Arthur Holdings and Development was hosting a massive, obscenely opulent celebration. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden light over hundreds of the city's most privileged socialites, local politicians, and aggressive banking executives. A live string quartet played an elegant classical arrangement in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to an event entirely funded by stolen assets and predatory fraud. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated smoothly through the crowd, pouring endless flutes of vintage champagne. In the center of the room, standing proudly beside a towering, intricately carved ice sculpture, was Madison. She was holding court, completely surrounded by a circle of her wealthy, perfectly coiffed friends. She was radiating an absolutely toxic, triumphant energy. Around her neck hung a blindingly bright, brand-new diamond tennis necklace, undoubtedly purchased with the cash advance her father had fronted her for successfully securing my eviction. She took a delicate sip of her mimosa, her voice carrying clearly over the ambient chatter of the room. "Oh, you have no idea the absolute nightmare it has been dealing with Tyson's father," Madison complained loudly, ensuring everyone in her immediate circle could hear her manufactured plight. "You know how those people get when they age. Completely hostile, refusing to understand basic economics, entirely unable to appreciate everything we were trying to do for him. We had to have him forcibly institutionalized this morning by private transport. It is a terrible burden, of course, but Tyson and I sacrificed so much of our own peace of mind to finally civilize that side of the family." Her friends nodded with synchronized fake sympathy, offering thinly veiled, deeply racist remarks disguised as pity. "You are so brave for taking on a family with that kind of background," one woman cooed, placing a manicured hand on Madison's shoulder. "It is definitely for the best that he is locked away in a state facility where professionals can manage his aggression." Madison smiled, a deeply satisfied, arrogant smile, thoroughly enjoying her role as the wealthy white savior who had bravely conquered the problematic black father-in-law. But directly across the massive ballroom, hovering desperately near the swinging doors of the service exit, a completely different reality was taking shape. Tyson had just arrived. He looked like a dead man walking. The expensive tailored suit he had worn so proudly that morning was now horribly wrinkled, stained with sweat, and dusted with the gravel from the county highway where he had abandoned me. His silk tie was yanked loose, hanging haphazardly around his neck. His face was a sickening shade of gray, dripping with a cold, terrified perspiration. Tyson was frantically trying to push his way through the dense, mingling crowd of elite guests to reach the main stage, but the sheer volume of the party was keeping him trapped near the back wall. His eyes were completely glued to the screen of his smartphone. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he watched the digital confirmation of his absolute doom. He knew the morning banking window had officially closed. He knew the non-refundable escrow transfer for Cottage 42 had legally cleared. He knew the million-dollar wire fraud had officially been executed across federal lines. Every single sip of champagne his wife took, every loud burst of laughter that erupted from his father-in-law made Tyson physically sicker. He was watching his entire fabricated high society life implode in real time, and he was completely powerless to stop the devastating financial bomb he had armed with his own bare hands. At the front of the ballroom, Arthur stepped up onto the elevated main stage. He approached a sleek silver microphone, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the chatter, signaling the room to quiet down. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur boomed into the microphone, his deep voice echoing powerfully from the surround sound speakers. "I want to propose a toast to the future of Arthur Holdings and Development. Today is a monumental day for our empire. This morning we officially secured the residential plot for our new luxury high-rise completely unopposed. And in a matter of hours we will finalize the acquisition of the 50-acre Tech Valley parcel, locking down the most valuable, undeveloped commercial real estate in this state for an absolute fraction of its true value. It truly is amazing what you can accomplish when you know exactly how to legally relieve the incompetent of their unearned assets." The crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause, raising their crystal glasses into the air to celebrate his predatory victory. Madison beamed with pride, raising her glass high, completely oblivious to her husband suffering a total psychological collapse just 50 feet away. I looked at Alistair standing beside me in the shadows. He gave me a single crisp nod. The time for observation was completely over. I raised my right hand and signaled the men standing directly behind me. The heavy, ornate mahogany double doors of the grand ballroom did not just open. They were violently, aggressively thrown apart. The massive slabs of wood slammed against the interior walls with a deafening, thunderous boom that shook the crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. The live string quartet shrieked to a horrifying dissonant halt, the cellist's bow scraping harshly across the strings in absolute shock. The polite applause died instantly in the throats of the wealthy guests. The music stopped dead. The laughter completely evaporated. The sudden suffocating silence that fell over the massive room was absolute, heavy and thick with sudden terror. Hundreds of privileged eyes snapped toward the main entrance, expecting to see a clumsy waiter or a drunken guest. Instead, they saw me. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the blinding, brilliant light of the ballroom. I walked with the slow, deliberate, unshakable stride of a king entering his own throne room. My posture was rigid, my expression forged from absolute steel. I did not look at the sea of shocked socialites. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, staring a hole straight through Arthur on the main stage. I was not alone. Alistair marched faithfully at my right shoulder, tightly clutching the heavy leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of their entire corporate legacy. And flanking us on both sides, their federal badges gleaming brightly under the opulent ballroom lights, were 4 heavily armed special agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The sudden and violent intrusion into the grand ballroom sent a massive shockwave through the affluent crowd. For a fleeting second, the only sound in the massive space was the delicate, high-pitched shattering of crystal as Arthur dropped his vintage champagne flute. It smashed against the polished hardwood stage, the expensive liquid pooling around his leather shoes. His face, previously flushed with the glow of triumphant arrogance, rapidly morphed into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in his thick neck bulged as his eyes locked onto me standing at the threshold in my bespoke suit flanked by federal authority. Security. Arthur bellowed into the microphone, his voice distorting into an ugly, desperate screech that echoed painfully through the surround sound speakers. Get in here right now. Grab that crazy old black man and throw him out into the street. He is a mental patient. He broke out of his transport. I want him and whoever brought him here removed from my country club immediately. From the periphery of the room, 4 heavily built private security guards in dark uniforms rushed forward, their hands reaching for their radios and utility belts, fully intending to aggressively tackle me to the ground. They did not even make it 5 steps. The 4 FBI special agents fanned out smoothly, forming an impenetrable human wall between me and the approaching guards. The lead agent reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out his golden federal badge, and held it high in the air for the entire ballroom to see. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The lead agent announced, his voice carrying the lethal, undeniable weight of the United States government. Stand down immediately, or you will be arrested for obstructing a federal operation. The security guards froze completely in their tracks, raising their hands and stepping backward into the shadows of the room, entirely unwilling to engage with armed federal agents over a country club dispute. The wealthy socialites, politicians, and banking executives who had just been toasting Arthur's brilliance began to rapidly back away from the main stage, their survival instincts kicking in as they desperately tried to distance themselves from whatever legal catastrophe was unfolding. Arthur stood frozen behind the podium, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked at the federal badges, then looked at me, his brain completely failing to comprehend how the frail, destitute man he had mocked just 24 hours ago was now commanding a federal raid on his victory party. Alistair did not wait for Arthur to recover his senses. Moving with the sleek, predatory grace of a corporate shark who smelled fresh blood in the water, my attorney walked directly up the steps of the elevated stage. He approached Arthur, gave him a cold, dismissive look, and smoothly pried the silver microphone right out of the billionaire's trembling hand. Ladies and gentlemen of the Oak Ridge Country Club, Alistair began, his smooth, articulate voice commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. My name is Alistair Sterling, Senior Managing Partner at Sterling & Vance Corporate Law. I represent Mr. Vincent Hayes, the gentleman standing by the doors. I apologize for interrupting your lavish evening, but we are here to officially correct a massive, incredibly costly misunderstanding regarding the properties my client legally owns. Alistair pulled a sleek black leather folder from his briefcase, opened it, and held up the fast cash sale agreement Tyson had signed that morning. This morning, Arthur Holdings and Development executed a contract to purchase a residential property in the valley, Alistair announced, projecting his voice perfectly. Arthur authorized an immediate cash advance of $1 million to secure the deed. However, the man who signed that property over to Arthur, Mr. Tyson Hayes, had absolutely zero legal authority to do so. The property in question does not belong to the estate of his late mother. It belongs exclusively to an irrevocable blind trust entirely controlled by my client, Mr. Vincent Hayes. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the crowd of investors and bankers. They knew exactly what that meant. They knew Arthur had just bought air. Therefore, Alistair continued, his tone turning razor-sharp. The contract Arthur Holdings executed today is entirely fraudulent and completely legally void. The deed transfer is nullified. But the catastrophe for your host does not end there. Because Arthur wired $1 million of corporate capital across international borders to a hidden offshore account held by a man committing title fraud, this transaction has triggered an immediate federal response. Alistair gestured to the lead FBI agent standing near the doors. As of 9:30 this morning, the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially froze the entire $1 million transfer on strict suspicion of international wire fraud and corporate money laundering. That money is gone, effectively seized by the federal government pending a massive sweeping audit of Arthur Holdings and Development. Arthur clutched his chest, staggering backward until his spine hit the carved ice sculpture behind him. He looked out into the crowd, desperately searching for his son-in-law. Tyson was still trapped near the service doors, openly weeping, his knees finally giving out as he slid down the wall and collapsed onto the floor in a puddle of his own pathetic ruin. He was going to federal prison, and he knew it. But Madison refused to accept defeat. The blinding reality of her husband's crimes and her father's massive financial loss shattered the fragile remnants of her sanity. She pushed her way through the crowd of terrified socialites, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. The heavy diamond tennis necklace bounced against her collarbone as she marched directly toward me, her designer heels stomping aggressively against the ballroom floor. "Shut up!" Madison screamed, pointing a violently shaking finger at Alistair and then at me. "You are lying. You are nothing but a bitter, miserable old mechanic trying to steal our moment. You think freezing $1 million is going to destroy us. You think a single residential house matters to a family like mine." She stopped just a few feet away from me, her chest heaving, completely ignoring the federal agent standing at my side. She threw her head back and let out a manic, desperate laugh that echoed chillingly through the silent ballroom. $1 million is absolutely nothing to my father," she shrieked proudly, broadcasting her ultimate trump card to the entire room, desperate to prove her inherent superiority. "It is a drop in the bucket. We do not care about your pathetic little house anymore, Vincent. Because tomorrow morning Arthur Holdings is acquiring the 50-acre Tech Valley parcel. We are closing the blind auction on Cottage 42. My father already locked out every other bidder with a $5 million non-refundable escrow transfer. By tomorrow afternoon, we will own the most valuable commercial real estate in this entire state. We are going to be untouchable billionaires, and you will still be a sad, lonely old man with absolutely nothing." She stood there panting, a deranged, triumphant smile plastered across her face. She truly believed the massive Tech Valley acquisition would magically erase the federal crimes they had committed. She thought Cottage 42 was their ultimate salvation, their guaranteed ticket to absolute invincibility. I looked at her, my expression completely unchanged, devoid of any anger or fear. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The total crushing silence of the ballroom amplified my every movement. I slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of my custom-tailored suit jacket. My calloused fingers brushed against the cold, heavy metal I had carried with me all day. I pulled out the heavy, rusted iron key that Evelyn had hidden beneath her pillbox. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward, closing the distance between myself and the extravagant VIP dining table situated right below the stage where Madison stood. I raised my right hand and slammed the rusted iron key down onto the pristine white tablecloth. The heavy metal struck the fine china and crystal glassware with a loud, violent clatter that made several guests physically jump in terror. I looked up from the table, my eyes locking directly onto Madison's pale, arrogant face, and then shifting upward to pierce her father, who was still trembling on the stage. "Did you really think that land was ownerless?" I asked, my voice slicing through the grand ballroom like a freshly sharpened executioner's blade. The heavy rusted iron key lay stark against the pristine white linen of the VIP dining table. Every single eye in the massive ballroom shifted from my face to that jagged piece of metal. The sharp clatter of the iron striking the table continued to echo in the minds of the wealthy elite standing frozen in the room. The complete and utter silence stretched out thick and suffocating as the implication of my words hung in the air. Madison blinked rapidly, her manic, triumphant grin slowly dissolving into a mask of severe confusion. She looked down at the key, her perfectly manicured hands trembling at her sides, unable to comprehend what a piece of scrap metal had to do with her multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. She was trying desperately to connect the dots between the poor, supposedly demented father-in-law she had just evicted and the massive Tech Valley real estate deal that was supposed to secure her billionaire status. On the stage behind her, Arthur gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. The color drained entirely from his flushed, arrogant face, replaced by a sickly ashen gray. He stared at the rusted key as if it were a highly venomous snake poised to strike. He had spent his entire career stepping on people like me, acquiring land-crushing small property owners, and assuming that his massive wealth granted him absolute immunity from consequence. He was about to learn the hardest lesson of his miserable life. The key was not just a symbol. It was the physical manifestation of 40 years of brilliant, flawless legal strategy orchestrated by a woman who was infinitely smarter than his entire team of highly paid corporate lawyers combined. Did you genuinely believe that a 50-acre parcel of prime commercial real estate in the center of the Tech Valley was just sitting there abandoned due to a municipal clerical error? I asked, stepping closer to the table. I looked directly into Arthur's terrified eyes, ensuring he heard every single syllable I spoke. You hired the most expensive acquisition lawyers in the state, and they completely failed you. They saw a labyrinth of blind proxy shell companies established in the 1980s and assumed it was dead corporate weight. They never bothered to dig deep enough to find the architect of that labyrinth. My late wife Evelyn built that holding structure to protect our assets from predatory developers exactly like you. We knew the corporate system was rigged against us, so she used your own legal frameworks to make our ownership absolutely invisible to greedy vultures. Madison shook her head violently, taking a frantic step backward. Her designer dress rustled loudly in the quiet room. "No!" she shrieked, her voice cracking in pure panic. "That is impossible. The city registry lists the owner as an anonymous corporate holding. You are a mechanic. You do not have the money to hold that land. My father is closing the auction. It is ours. You are just trying to ruin my night because you are bitter." Alistair stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. He opened his sleek leather briefcase, pulled out a thick, officially stamped legal document, and slammed it onto the table right next to the rusted key. It lists the owner as the V. Hayes Trust. Alistair declared, his voice ringing with absolute legal authority that commanded the entire ballroom. The letter V stands for Vincent, my client, Mr. My client. Vincent Hayes is the sole creator, the exclusive chairman, and the absolute sovereign owner of the V. Hayes Trust. He holds the exclusive deed to the 50 acres you call Cottage 42. He has owned that land entirely debt-free for over 30 years. You are not bidding on an abandoned municipal plot. You are bidding on my client's private estate. The collective gasp from the ballroom was deafening. The realization hit the crowd of wealthy elites like a physical shockwave. Whispers broke out among the banking executives and local politicians as they rapidly backed away from Madison and Arthur, treating them like walking toxic waste. Madison let out a strange, choked noise, her hands flying to her mouth as the devastating reality shattered her fabricated world. She had spent the entire week torturing, starving, and trying to institutionalize the very man who owned the ultimate prize her family was betting their entire corporate survival on. She had treated the owner of a multi-million-dollar Tech Valley empire like a stray dog, completely unaware that she was actively insulting the master of her own fate. Arthur stumbled down the steps of the stage, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked like a man who had just been thrown out of an airplane without a parachute, but the escrow, he wheezed, his voice barely a whisper as he pointed a shaking finger at Alistair. "We wired $5 million in non-refundable liquid capital into the municipal holding account this morning. We locked out the auction. We transferred the funds. The land has to be ours." "You did not wire $5 million into a municipal holding account," Alistair corrected him sharply, his tone devoid of any mercy. "You wired $5 million directly into a heavily monitored private escrow account completely controlled by my firm on behalf of the V. Hayes Trust. And because you explicitly authorized that massive wire transfer while simultaneously executing a fraudulent real estate contract using a forged residential deed signed by your son-in-law, you legally triggered a federal forfeiture clause. You attempted to leverage illegally obtained residential assets to secure a commercial corporate bid. By the strict laws governing blind auctions and federal wire transfers, your $5 million deposit is now permanently forfeited due to severe documented financial fraud." The lead FBI agent stepped forward, reinforcing Alistair's statement. Mr. Arthur, your corporate accounts have been frozen and the $5 million you transferred is currently seized as punitive damages payable to the victim of your son-in-law's residential title fraud. You do not get the land, and you are never getting that $5 million back. It legally belongs to Mr. Hayes. The magnitude of the destruction was absolute. Arthur Holdings and Development was already severely over-leveraged. Arthur had drained his company's entire liquid reserves pulled from employee pension funds and borrowed heavily against his existing commercial properties just to secure that massive cash deposit. Without that cash and without the Tech Valley land to satisfy his aggressive creditors, his entire corporate empire was completely mathematically dead. The banks would call in his loans by tomorrow morning and he would be utterly ruined. Arthur let out a horrifying guttural sound, clutching the left side of his chest with both hands as his knees completely buckled beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor of the ballroom, his face twisting in sheer agonizing panic as his heart gave out under the crushing weight of his monumental failure. Madison screamed, dropping to her knees beside him, her expensive diamond necklace swinging wildly as she desperately called out for a doctor. The grand, arrogant celebration had instantly turned into a spectacular, catastrophic graveyard. In less than a single minute, I had legally dismantled their arrogance, entirely vaporized their unearned wealth, and completely destroyed the empire they thought made them untouchable. The chaotic aftermath of Arthur's sudden collapse sent the remaining country club staff into a sheer panic. 2 club medics rushed forward with an emergency kit, pushing past the frozen socialites to attend to the fallen billionaire. Madison was on her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his chest, shrieking for someone to call an ambulance. But the federal agents standing at my side did not flinch, nor did they step back to offer her any respectful distance. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, his polished black shoes stopping mere inches from Madison's designer dress. He did not kneel to comfort her. He reached to his utility belt and unclipped a pair of heavy stainless steel handcuffs. Madison Arthur. The agent announced, his voice cutting through the frantic murmurs of the ballroom with absolute, undeniable authority. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, the falsification of official medical records, and filing a fraudulent police report with the intent to extort. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Madison snapped her head up, her pale eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and sheer terror. You cannot arrest me, she shrieked, scrambling backward on the polished hardwood floor, her expensive heels slipping out from under her. My father is having a medical emergency. You are making a massive mistake. Do you have any idea who I am? I will have your badge for this. The agent did not engage in a debate. He moved with swift, practiced efficiency, grabbing her flailing wrist and forcing her arm behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around Madison's wrists echoed loudly, a sound of absolute finality that shattered her arrogant illusion forever. She thrashed wildly, fighting the federal agent like a spoiled child throwing a tantrum, but her resistance was entirely futile. The agent secured her other wrist, locking her firmly in place. The physical struggle caused her carefully pinned hair to fall in messy, tangled strands across her face. Hot, desperate tears streamed from her eyes, mixing with her heavy, expensive makeup. Dark, ugly streaks of mascara and foundation ran down her pale cheeks, completely destroying the pristine high society image she had meticulously crafted. She looked absolutely pathetic, a far cry from the smug, untouchable woman who had tossed a fraudulent eviction notice onto my coffee table just 1 week ago. She screamed for her father to do something, to call his lawyers to make this go away. But Arthur was unresponsive, being loaded onto a medical stretcher by the paramedics. Suddenly, a violent commotion erupted near the service doors at the back of the ballroom. The crowd of terrified guests parted rapidly as a figure pushed frantically through the throng. It was Tyson. He had watched the entire catastrophic collapse from the shadows. He had seen the $5 million escrow completely vanish. He had seen his powerful father-in-law suffer a massive heart attack and fall to the floor. And now he was watching his untouchable wife being dragged away in federal handcuffs. He knew the FBI possessed the exact routing numbers for his offshore accounts. He knew his embezzlement records were completely exposed. His entire fabricated world had disintegrated into ash. Tyson did not run toward his wife to comfort her. He did not run to his fallen father-in-law to offer assistance. His survival instinct kicked in, and he ran directly toward the only source of absolute power remaining in the room. He ran toward me, He sprinted across the ballroom floor, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with sweat. He threw himself forward, his knees slamming violently against the polished hardwood right at my feet. He wrapped his arms tightly around my legs, burying his face against the fabric of my tailored trousers, sobbing with a loud, guttural desperation that echoed through the silent, watching crowd. "Dad, please." Tyson wailed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You have to stop this. Tell them to stop. You have the money. You own the trust. You can hire the best defense lawyers in the country. You can fix all of this. Please, Dad, I am begging you. Save me." I looked down at the top of his head, feeling the frantic, terrified trembling of his body against my legs. He was completely unraveling. "I am your son," he cried out, his tears soaking into my pants. "I did not want to do any of this. Madison made me do it. She threatened to expose my old accounting mistakes. She manipulated me. She forced me to sign those fast cash sale papers. I was just trying to provide a good life for us. I was just trying to make you and Mom proud. You have to protect me, Dad. I am your only child." I stood perfectly rigid like a monument carved from solid black granite. I did not kick him away, but I absolutely did not reach down to comfort him. I let him grovel. I let the hundreds of wealthy, privileged guests in that ballroom watch this arrogant man completely humiliate himself at the feet of the elderly black mechanic he had tried to throw away like garbage. I looked down at him with an expression devoid of any anger, any sorrow, or any paternal warmth. There was only a cold, infinite, absolute zero. "You want me to protect you?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft, yet carrying perfectly across the silent room. "You want me to use the fortune your mother built to save you from the consequences of your own treacherous greed?" Tyson nodded frantically against my legs, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. "Yes, Dad. Please. I am so sorry. I will do whatever you want." I kept my gaze locked onto his terrified face. "Let us talk about protection, Tyson," I said evenly. "Let us rewind to yesterday evening in my living room. Do you remember what happened when Madison realized I would not sign your fraudulent psychiatric surrender forms? I remember it with perfect clarity. I remember watching her tear her own silk blouse down the middle. I remember watching her drag her fingernails across her own skin to draw blood. I remember her running out onto the freezing porch screaming to the entire neighborhood that a black man was violently attacking her." Tyson flinched, closing his eyes tightly, as if physical blows were raining down upon him. "You knew exactly what she was doing," I continued, my voice growing harder, striking him like a hammer. "You knew that in this country, her false accusation was a guaranteed death sentence for me. You knew that when those police officers kicked down my front door with their weapons drawn, my life hung by a single fragile thread. And what did you do to protect me, Tyson? Did you stand up for your father? Did you step in front of the guns and tell the truth?" Tyson sobbed louder, burying his face in his hands, completely unable to formulate a single excuse. "No," I answered for him. "You cowered in the corner of my living room. You were so utterly terrified of losing your fake prestige that you shoved a pen into my chest and begged me to sign my own freedom away. You pleaded with me to lock myself inside a secure psychiatric ward for the rest of my life just so the police would go easy on the situation, and your wife's psychotic lie would remain protected. You were perfectly willing to let me die or let me rot in a cell just to save your own miserable skin." Tyson shook his head violently side to side, his hands grasping frantically at my jacket. "Dad, please do not do this. We are family. Mom would want you to forgive me. She sacrificed everything for family. You cannot abandon your own flesh and blood." I reached down and grabbed his wrists with a firm iron grip. I pried his shaking hands off my suit, forcing him to release me. I stepped back, severing the physical connection between us forever. "Evelyn died carrying the heavy burden of your shame," I said, delivering the final crushing truth with absolute unwavering conviction. "I built this empire to protect the people I love. My wealth, my protection, and my mercy are strictly reserved for my family." Tyson looked up at me, his face completely broken, realizing the absolute finality of the moment. "And you ceased to be my family the exact moment you handed me that pen," I stated coldly. I turned my back on him. I did not look over my shoulder as the second FBI special agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt to arrest my former son for corporate embezzlement, real estate fraud, and criminal conspiracy. I simply adjusted my suit jacket and walked away, leaving him to drown in the shallow, pathetic grave he had dug for himself. The chaotic, frantic aftermath of the country club raid faded into a distant memory as Alistair's town car carried me away from the wreckage of Arthur's corporate empire. I did not stay to watch the paramedics wheel Arthur out on a stretcher, nor did I linger to see the federal agents load a sobbing Madison and a completely broken Tyson into the back of their unmarked vehicles. The battle was over. The execution was absolute. I asked Alistair to drop me off exactly where he had picked me up on the deserted county road. My rusted Ford F-150 was still parked on the gravel shoulder, waiting patiently in the freezing winter air. I shook my oldest friend's hand, thanked him for a flawless legal operation, and climbed back into the cab of my truck. The engine roared to life, and I turned the steering wheel, pointing the heavy vehicle back toward the Tech Valley. I had one final destination today, a place I needed to see not as a strategic asset, but as the man Evelyn had loved for 4 decades. I drove through the bustling, affluent streets of the valley, watching the towering structures of glass and steel catch the fiery orange and purple hues of the setting sun. I turned onto the pristine private access road and approached the massive wrought iron gates of the 50-acre parcel. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out the heavy rusted iron key. I stepped out of the truck, inserted the key into the electronic security panel, and turned it. The heavy metal mechanisms clicked loudly, and the imposing gates swung open automatically, granting me access to my own sovereign territory. I drove the truck onto the property, the tires crunching loudly against the paved commercial perimeter. During my first visit, I had been so overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the undeveloped acreage that I had only walked the outer boundaries. This time, I drove deeper. I followed a narrow, unpaved service road that snaked its way directly into the center of the massive plot. As I drove further away from the main boulevard, the landscape began to shift dramatically. The ambient noise of the surrounding city traffic, the distant hum of the neighboring software headquarters, and the aggressive construction sounds from the adjacent commercial plaza all began to fade away, swallowed entirely by a thick, dense wall of towering evergreen trees. The service road cut through the ancient timber, creating a natural, impenetrable visual and acoustic barrier against the modern world outside. I crested a small wooded ridge, and the heavy canopy of trees suddenly opened up. I hit the brakes, throwing the truck into park, my breath completely catching in my throat. Hidden squarely in the exact center of this multi-million-dollar commercial gold mine was a pristine, crystal-clear private lake. The surface of the water was perfectly still, reflecting the brilliant colors of the sunset like a giant mirror. And sitting quietly on the grassy edge of the water, surrounded by weeping willows and wild, unbothered nature, was a beautifully crafted, authentic wooden log cabin. It was the real Cottage 42. It was not just a clever corporate shell name or a mundane title meant to throw predatory developers off the scent. It was a literal physical place. I stepped out of the truck and walked slowly toward the cabin, completely captivated by the sheer beauty and absolute tranquility of the hidden sanctuary. Evelyn had not just secured 50 acres of prime commercial zoning to build a massive financial portfolio. She had deliberately cordoned off the center of the property, refusing to lease it to the tech conglomerate specifically to protect this small, perfect patch of undisturbed earth. She had built this place in absolute secrecy as a final sanctuary for the two of us. She knew exactly how harsh, unforgiving, and deeply prejudiced the outside world could be. She knew how exhausting it was for us to constantly keep our heads down to play by the rigged rules of a society that always looked for a reason to push us to the bottom. She saw how the pursuit of money and status had completely poisoned our only son, turning Tyson into a stranger who was ashamed of his own parents. Evelyn built this cabin away from all of it. She created a world where we could just be Vincent and Evelyn. No corporate battles, no racist neighbors, no greedy family members demanding cash. She built it not for wealth, but out of pure, enduring, protective love. I walked up the sturdy wooden steps to the spacious front porch, the sturdy planks creaking softly under my polished Oxfords. I reached for the brass doorknob. It was unlocked, waiting for me. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. The air smelled of rich cedarwood, dried lavender, and the faint, familiar scent of Evelyn's favorite vanilla perfume. The interior was fully furnished, impeccably decorated with cozy woven rugs, plush leather armchairs, and a large stone fireplace that mirrored the one in our suburban home. Resting in the center of a rustic wooden coffee table was a heavy leather-bound memory box. I walked over and opened the brass latch. Inside were hundreds of old photographs. I picked up the stack and walked back outside, carrying the memories onto the front porch. I sat down in a heavy wooden rocking chair facing the serene glass-like surface of the hidden lake. The sun was dipping below the tree line, casting long, peaceful shadows across the water. I slowly sifted through the photographs. There was a picture of Evelyn and me on our wedding day, standing in front of a modest brick church, beaming with the kind of hope that only the young and the broke truly possess. There were photos of us standing proudly in front of our very first home, holding the keys, our hands covered in paint from fixing up the walls ourselves. There were pictures of our quiet anniversaries, simple dinners at cheap diners, moments where we had absolutely nothing in the bank but everything in each other. Looking at her beautiful, smiling face, the heavy, calculated armor I had worn all day finally cracked. The cold, tactical executive who had just destroyed a billionaire empire melted away, leaving only the grieving husband behind. I let the tears fall freely down my cheeks. It was a clean, pure grief. The toxic infection of Tyson and Madison's betrayal had been completely burned away, surgically removed from my life forever. I was crying not out of anger or betrayal, but out of a profound, overwhelming gratitude for the brilliant, fiercely loving woman who had spent her entire life shielding me from the worst of humanity. I sat on the porch of the hidden cottage as the evening sky shifted from orange to a deep, starry black. The absolute silence of the lake was a stark contrast to the chaotic screaming frenzy of the country club ballroom just hours earlier. I thought about Arthur clutching his chest as his entire corporate kingdom collapsed around him because he was too arrogant to verify the foundation of his greed. I thought about Tyson throwing away his own father for the empty promise of $1 million and a seat at a table that despised him. They worshipped money as if it were a god. They believed it granted them superiority immunity and absolute control over people like me. But sitting on a multi-million-dollar estate that they could never touch, I realized the ultimate unvarnished truth about wealth. Money is a highly dangerous, venomous tool. It absolutely cannot buy a single ounce of genuine happiness, loyalty, or love. Evelyn and I were at our absolute happiest when we had nothing but a leaky roof and each other. Money did not make us love each other more, and the lack of it never made us love each other less. But in a world completely designed to crush you, to silence your voice, and to strip away your fundamental humanity, the sheer power of money does one very specific critical thing. It builds an impenetrable fortress around your dignity. It provides the ultimate undeniable power to say no. It ensures that when ruthless, entitled people try to kick you out into the freezing street and erase your existence, you have the heavy artillery required to completely dismantle their reality. Evelyn did not leave me a fortune so I could live like Arthur or Madison. She left me a fortune to guarantee that no one would ever have the power to make me bow my head again. 2 months passed. The harsh, biting winter thawed into a crisp and promising spring. I spent my mornings sitting on the spacious wooden porch of Cottage 42, sipping hot black coffee and listening to the quiet rustle of the weeping willows against the surface of the private lake. I had transitioned into my new life, seamlessly leaving the suburban house behind entirely. My morning routine now included reading the major financial newspapers delivered to the security gate of my estate. The front pages of the business section had been dominated for weeks by a single spectacular ongoing story: the absolute catastrophic implosion of Arthur Holdings and Development. The fallout from the country club raid had been swift and utterly merciless. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation froze Arthur's $5 million escrow deposit, the structural integrity of his entire over-leveraged empire instantly vaporized. The news detailed how his aggressive creditors descended like starving vultures within 48 hours. Banks called in their massive commercial loans. Construction projects across the valley were immediately halted, wrapped in yellow tape, and seized by municipal courts. The towering corporate headquarters on Fifth Avenue, where Arthur had ruled with an iron fist, was gutted and liquidated to pay off a mountain of accumulated fraudulent debt. The media painted a grim, highly publicized picture of a greedy titan who flew too close to the sun and burned his entire legacy to the ground in a desperate grab for absolute power. It was a flawless execution of justice, playing out in black and white print. The news reports highlighted the complex legal consequences, but Alistair provided me with the deeply satisfying, unvarnished personal details. Arthur did not die on the hardwood floor of the country club ballroom, though his pride certainly did. The massive cardiac event was accompanied by a severe stroke that left the arrogant billionaire partially paralyzed on his left side. When he finally woke up in the intensive care unit, he woke up to a reality completely stripped of his wealth, his influence, and his power. Because of the sheer magnitude of his financial crimes and the gross negligence of his corporate borrowing, the federal government seized his sprawling mansion, his fleet of luxury vehicles, and his hidden offshore accounts to pay back the defrauded pension funds. Today, the man who used to casually evict low-income families to build his overpriced luxury condos is living in a cramped, neglected one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. He relies entirely on a meager state-issued disability check surrounded by peeling wallpaper, leaky pipes, and a property management company that completely ignores his maintenance requests. It is a brilliant poetic symmetry. He is spending his final years trapped in the exact kind of poverty he spent his entire life weaponizing against people who looked like me. He is entirely powerless, voiceless, and utterly alone. And then there was Madison, the untouchable privileged socialite who had weaponized her race and her fake tears to try and have me killed in my own living room, was currently discovering how the real justice system actually works. She was flatly denied bail. The sheer volume of evidence against her, including my high-definition hidden camera footage and the forged psychiatric documents she helped orchestrate, led to a swift and brutal federal conviction. The judge did not care about her designer clothes, her prestigious country club memberships, or her wealthy upbringing. Madison was sentenced to 7 years in a maximum security state penitentiary for extortion, filing false police reports, and participating in an international wire fraud conspiracy. Alistair informed me with a deep sense of satisfaction that she had been assigned to the sanitation detail by the prison warden. The woman who once stood in my kitchen wearing thick yellow rubber gloves to dramatically throw away my fresh groceries was now wearing those exact same gloves to scrub industrial toilets and mop concrete shower floors for her fellow inmates. She wears a cheap, ill-fitting, scratchy orange jumpsuit. She eats mass-produced, tasteless cafeteria food served on a plastic tray. She sleeps on a thin, uncomfortable mattress in a tiny cell with no windows. The blinding diamond tennis necklace she flaunted so proudly at her father's party was seized as physical evidence of the wire fraud. Every single ounce of her unearned superiority had been violently scrubbed away, leaving behind nothing but a convicted felon paying her debt to a society she once thought she inherently owned. I finished reading the morning paper, folded it neatly, and walked down the long private gravel service road toward the main security gates to check the mail. The walk was peaceful, the air smelling of pine needles and damp earth. Among the standard utility bills and legal updates from Alistair, there was a single crumpled envelope stamped with the official black ink seal of the state correctional facility. The handwriting on the front of the envelope was shaky, desperate, and immediately recognizable. It was from Tyson. I carried the letter back to the cabin, my footsteps slow and deliberate. I sat down in my heavy wooden rocking chair, overlooking the quiet glass like water of the lake, and tore open the seal. The letter inside was heavily stained with dried tears and written with a frantic, pleading energy that radiated off the page. Tyson wrote page after page of pathetic, long-winded excuses. He blamed Madison for manipulating his mind and poisoning his perspective. He blamed Arthur for pressuring him into a world of corporate greed he was not ready for. He claimed the harsh prison environment was physically and mentally destroying him. He described the terrifying isolation of his cell and begged me to come visit him during the designated weekend visiting hours. The final paragraph of the letter was the most predictable and utterly disgusting of all. He invoked his mother. He wrote that Evelyn would never want her only son to rot in a federal cell, that she would want us to reconcile and heal our fractured bond. He outright begged me to use the limitless financial resources of the V. Hayes Trust to hire an expensive appellate lawyer to completely overturn his conviction. He claimed he was a changed man, that he had learned his lesson, and that he just needed one more chance to prove he could be a good son. Even from behind steel bars, he was still trying to use my late wife's sacred memory as a crowbar to pry open my financial vault. I sat there holding the fragile, tear-stained pages in my lap, listening to the gentle breeze rustling through the evergreen trees. I looked out over the water, waiting to feel a spark of paternal sympathy. I waited to feel a sudden pang of regret, a twist of guilt, or a sudden overwhelming urge to rescue the boy I had raised from the terrible consequences of his own actions. But absolutely nothing came. My chest was a quiet, steady drum of pure, unshakable indifference. The words on the paper were entirely hollow. Tyson was not apologizing for what he had done to me. He was only apologizing because he had been caught completely stripped of his fake prestige and locked in a cage. He had made his ultimate choice the night he shoved a pen into my chest and begged me to sign my own freedom away to a locked psychiatric ward just to save his fraudulent career. He had willingly traded his father's life for $1 million that did not even exist. I stood up from the rocking chair, folded the letter neatly in half, and walked back inside the warm cabin. I approached the large rustic stone fireplace where a small morning fire was already crackling gently against the chill of the spring air. I did not write a response. I did not call my lawyer to arrange a prison visit. I simply reached out and dropped his desperate, manipulative letter directly onto the burning oak logs. I watched as the bright orange flames immediately caught the edges of the paper. The fire curled the pages, turning his pathetic excuses into brittle black ash that floated silently up the chimney and disappeared into the sky. I watched it burn until there was absolutely nothing left. There is no easy forgiveness for a blood betrayal, and there is no coming back from the choices he made. I turned my back to the fireplace, poured myself another cup of hot coffee, and stepped back out onto the porch to enjoy the profound, unbroken peace of my new life. The vast, undeniable wealth of the V. Hayes Trust was never meant to simply sit in high-yield investment accounts gathering digital dust. Evelyn had not spent decades meticulously navigating the treacherous, racially biased waters of corporate real estate just so I could spend my final years idly sitting on a porch. She built our fortune as a fortress, a massive, impenetrable wall designed to protect us from a society that constantly sought to strip away our dignity. Now that my own personal battle was definitively won, I realized that my fortress was large enough to shelter others. I picked up my phone and called Alistair. I told my oldest friend that our work was not finished. It was actually just beginning. I directed him to draft the necessary legal charters to establish a massive, fully funded nonprofit legal foundation. We named it Evelyn's Shield. The primary mission of Evelyn's Shield was highly specific and deeply personal. We targeted the silent, insidious epidemic of financial elder abuse specifically within the Black community. For generations, elderly Black men and women in this country have been systematically targeted not just by predatory banking institutions and aggressive developers, but tragically by their own greedy family members. I knew exactly how it felt to sit in a quiet living room and realize the people you raised were actively calculating the monetary value of your demise. I knew the profound, suffocating terror of having your mental competence weaponized against you by the very children you sacrificed your youth to protect. I refused to let another hardworking, vulnerable senior citizen face that terrifying darkness alone. I diverted a massive percentage of the monthly commercial leasing revenue generated by Cottage 42 directly into the foundation. I did not just hire a few paralegals to offer polite advice. I instructed Alistair to recruit a small army of the most aggressive, relentless, and brilliant corporate litigators in the state. We did not write sternly worded letters. We filed devastating, financially crippling lawsuits against anyone who attempted to exploit the elderly. Within the first 6 months of operation, Evelyn's Shield became an absolute force of nature. Our legal team took on dozens of cases that the local authorities had previously dismissed as private civil disputes. I personally reviewed the intake files every single morning from my desk overlooking the private lake. One of our very first victories involved an 82-year-old widow named Mrs. Jenkins. Her grandson, a man who shared a striking, sickening resemblance to Tyson's brand of cowardly entitlement, had secretly forged her signature to take out a massive second mortgage on her family home. He used the cash to fund a failing startup venture, leaving his grandmother facing imminent foreclosure and absolute ruin. The local police told her it was a family matter. Evelyn's Shield stepped in within 48 hours. We did not just stop the foreclosure. Alistair's team deployed the exact same ruthless, scorched earth tactics we had used against Arthur Holdings. We legally froze the grandson's startup assets, tied up his personal accounts in aggressive litigation, and filed a comprehensive brief with the district attorney that resulted in his immediate indictment for elder financial fraud. We restored the deed to Mrs. Jenkins completely debt-free and ensured her grandson would never be allowed within 500 feet of her or her finances again. When she called me on the phone to thank me, her voice thick with tears of profound relief, I felt a deep, powerful resonance in my chest. This became my new routine. This became my absolute purpose. The crushing, hollow grief that had threatened to consume me after Evelyn passed away was entirely replaced by a fierce, righteous fire. I was no longer just a retired mechanic passing the time. I was the chairman of a movement. My days were filled with strategy meetings, reviewing legal briefs, and directing funds to safeguard the legacies of men and women who had worked their entire lives just to build a tiny sliver of generational wealth. We protected their homes, we secured their pensions, and we aggressively prosecuted the treacherous relatives who tried to strip them of their autonomy. Watching these predators face the devastating, uncompromising reality of the justice system provided me with a profound daily satisfaction. I had taken the worst, most agonizing betrayal of my entire life and forged it into a lethal weapon for absolute good. I felt stronger, sharper, and more vibrant at 69 years old than I had in decades. As the months turned into a warm, golden summer, the landscape around Cottage 42 completely transformed. The heavy winter frost gave way to lush, vibrant greenery. The weeping willows surrounding the private lake dipped their long, elegant branches directly into the cool, crystal-clear water. I had hired a small, discreet landscaping crew to help me cultivate the grounds, but there was one specific project I insisted on handling entirely with my own two hands. Evelyn absolutely loved red roses. During our hardest years when we were living paycheck to paycheck and I came home covered in grease from the printing press, I would always try to save a few dollars to buy her a single red rose from the corner bodega. She would place it in a cheap glass vase on our kitchen table, treating it like it was the most valuable jewel in the world. I ordered dozens of premium mature red rose bushes. I spent my weekends kneeling in the rich, dark soil near the edge of the water, digging the plots, mixing the compost, and carefully planting each bush. I wore my old faded denim overalls and a wide-brimmed straw hat, the hot summer sun beating down on my back. The physical labor was deeply therapeutic. My hands, calloused and scarred from 40 years of turning wrenches and fixing heavy machinery, were now entirely devoted to nurturing life. I ran the heavy green garden hose from the side of the log cabin, standing quietly on the grassy bank as the cool water showered over the bright crimson petals. The sweet, rich fragrance of the blooming roses mixed perfectly with the fresh, earthy scent of the lake water. I stood there in the absolute, unbroken tranquility of my hidden sanctuary, letting the gentle spray of the hose wash over the dark green leaves. The contrast between this pristine, vibrant peace and the sterile, desperate, suffocating world of corporate greed that Arthur and Madison lived in was staggering. They spent their entire lives chasing a hollow, toxic illusion of superiority. They betrayed their own blood, ruined their own families, and destroyed their own freedom, all for the temporary thrill of a larger bank account and the fleeting approval of high society. They lived in constant, agonizing fear of losing their status. But out here, surrounded by the towering evergreens and the brilliant red roses, I possessed the one thing their money could never genuinely buy. I had complete, absolute peace. I had a clear conscience, a protected legacy, and the undeniable knowledge that I had honored the love of my life in the most spectacular way possible. I turned the brass nozzle on the hose, shutting off the water. I wiped my soil-stained hands on the thick denim of my overalls and looked out across the mirror-like surface of the lake. I thought about Tyson sitting in his tiny, windowless concrete cell, facing years of federal time, completely cut off from the wealth he had been so willing to kill for. I thought about Madison wearing an orange jumpsuit, scrubbing prison floors with the exact same hands she had once used to dramatically throw away my food. I thought about Arthur, a broken, paralyzed man trapped in a cheap, decaying apartment entirely forgotten by the wealthy elites who used to drink his champagne. They had orchestrated a massive, cruel conspiracy. They had looked at a quiet, grieving, elderly black man and saw nothing but a weak, disposable victim. They saw a convenient stepping stone for their own arrogant ambitions. They thought they could easily throw me into the dark pile dirt on top of my head and completely bury me under the thick, suffocating mud of their own treachery and greed. But they made one massive, fatal miscalculation. They did not know that I was a seed. And a seed always knows exactly how to break through the dirt reach for the sun and relentlessly bloom. If there is one final lesson I want to impart, it is to beware the quiet ones. Society teaches us that power is loud, that wealth demands a stage, and that silence equates to weakness. Tyson and Madison believed their expensive suits, designer bags, and arrogant demands made them invincible. But true power does not need to scream to be heard. It waits, it watches, it builds an unshakable foundation while others are busy building fragile facades. Never mistake a person's humility for fragility, and never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has everything to protect. If my journey inspired you to stand your ground and defend your dignity, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own thoughts in the comments below.